Day 31, I think. The clock on the control panel says it's 6:47 in the morning, but I stopped trusting what morning means about 2 weeks ago. Underground, morning is just the number on a screen. I've started making myself eat breakfast when it says 7 a.m. anyway, because I read somewhere that routine is what keeps people sane in long-term isolation. I don't know if I believe that anymore, but I'm still doing it. I'm recording this on the compound's internal camera system, Channel 3, the one mounted in the control room above the main console. Aldous Pemberton, whoever you were, wherever you went, you built good cameras. The image is still sharp. There's no sound distortion. I've been talking to this camera for about a week now, after I figured out how to access the recording function. Before that, I was just talking to myself, which felt worse, somehow. Like at least this way there's a record. Like at least this way if someone finds this place after I'm gone, they'll know what happened here. My name is Garrett Marsh. I'm 34 years old. I was an environmental surveyor for a consulting firm out of Asheville, North Carolina. Was, past tense. I keep doing that, slipping between tenses like I'm not sure which one applies anymore. Let me start from the beginning, because if I'm going to make this record useful, I need to do it properly. That's the surveyor in me. Start at the datum point. Work outward from there. I found this place by accident. That's the honest version. I found it because I was doing my job, and my job required me to walk through parts of the property that no client had ever intended anyone to walk through. The estate sits on about 340 acres in the Pisgah National Forest boundary zone, west of Brevard. Private land, adjacent to federal. The kind of private land that has signs every 50 feet and trail cameras every 100. The kind where wealthy people who want to be left alone have invested serious money into making sure they are. I'd been contracted by the estate's legal trust, not by Pemberton himself. I never dealt with him directly, to complete a Phase 1 environmental assessment ahead of some permitting work. Routine job, soil samples, slope erosion analysis, invasive species documentation, the kind of thing I'd done 200 times before. The estate looked abandoned when I got there. The main house was locked, the gravel drive had weeds coming through it, and there was a notice on the front gate from the property management company saying something about temporary closure for renovation. I wasn't there for the house. My work was in the back 40, where the ridge dropped off toward a creek that the permit application mentioned as a potential runoff concern. I spent 3 days doing the initial survey. The first 2 were completely uneventful. I took samples. I photographed erosion patterns. I documented a small population of non-native kudzu along the fence line. Standard work. On the 3rd day, I went further up the ridge than my survey area technically required, because I'd noticed an anomaly on the topo map I was working from. A flat shelf of ground at about 4,200 feet that didn't match the surrounding terrain in a way that made sense geologically. This is what I do. I notice things that don't match. It's not a talent so much as a habit. Spend enough years looking at ground, and you start to feel when something's off about it. I climbed up to the shelf. It took about 40 minutes from the creek bed because the grade was steeper than it looked on the map. When I got there, I was standing on a roughly rectangular area of ground, maybe 60 by 90 feet, covered in grass and a few young white pines. Ordinary looking, except the grass was too uniform, and the soil composition under my boots felt different, denser, more compacted, lacking the organic layer you'd expect on undisturbed mountain ground. I walked the perimeter of the shelf. At the north end there was a rock outcropping, which was natural enough. At the south end, there was a drainage ditch that disappeared into a concrete culvert. The culvert was new. Well, not new, but newer than it looked. The concrete had been deliberately treated to give it an aged appearance, and whoever did it was good at it, but not quite good enough. The aggregate mix was off for the region. I took a photo of the culvert and made a note in my field book. Possible undisclosed construction. Check permit records. Then I walked around the rock outcropping at the north end. Behind it, set back into the rock face and covered by what turned out to be a panel of artificial stone, high-quality composite, painted and textured, was a keypad. Stainless steel, weatherproofed. The LED on the front was green. Green meant it was active. Green meant it had power, which meant something underground had a generator running. I stood there looking at that keypad for probably 2 full minutes. Then I took a photo of it, checked the time, noted the GPS coordinates in my field book, and walked back down the ridge to my truck. I finished my survey work. I wrote my assessment. I submitted the report to the legal trust and got paid. Standard rate, net 30. But I kept the photos. And I kept the GPS coordinates. That was 14 months before everything fell apart. I went back twice before it happened. Once in November of that year, just to verify the coordinates were right and that I hadn't imagined it. The keypad was still there, still green. I didn't try to access it. I'm not a burglar, I'm a surveyor, and there's a difference. But I did circle the rock outcropping more carefully that time and found the seams in the artificial stone panel. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. The seams were tight and treated. From more than 10 feet away, it looked completely natural. The second time I went back was in March, about 5 weeks before the first news reports came in. I went back for a reason I have trouble explaining even now. I wasn't planning to do anything. I drove up the forest road, parked at the same pull-off I always used, hiked up the ridge. I stood in front of the keypad, and I thought about a lot of things. I thought about the fact that the legal trust had quietly dropped the permitting application they'd hired me to support. I thought about the fact that 3 weeks after I submitted my assessment, I'd noticed a small news item about the estate, something to do with property taxes in arrears, a dispute between the trust and the county assessor. I thought about the fact that whatever was under this mountain had been running on power for at least 14 months, which meant someone was paying the utility bill, which meant it wasn't abandoned. I thought about the keypad. I thought about trying it. Then I thought, that's not your problem, Garrett. You did your job, you got paid. Walk back down the mountain. So I walked back down the mountain. I don't know what I would have done if I'd had any idea what was coming. I don't know if I would have tried to access it then, had everything ready, prepared properly. Probably not. I'm the kind of person who needs events to actually be happening before he responds to them. I'm not a prepper. I'm not paranoid. I'm just a guy who notices things. I noticed them about 3 weeks too late. The first sign wasn't what you'd expect. It wasn't a news broadcast or a hospital announcement. It was a smell. I was in Waynesville, finishing up a different job, a stream corridor assessment for a residential developer, and there was this smell coming from the east, from the direction of Asheville, that I couldn't place. It was heavy and sweet in a way that wasn't pleasant, underneath what I initially assumed was someone burning yard waste, except it was November, and burning ordinances were in effect, and it was 11 in the morning on a Tuesday. I mentioned it to the property owner, a guy named Holt Dugan, who'd been trailing me around his land all morning, asking questions about drainage. He sniffed the air and said he didn't smell anything. I let it go. That night I checked my phone. There was a news notification about a hospital in Asheville being placed on internal lockdown due to what the report called a respiratory illness outbreak with atypical presentation. The hospital's communications department had put out a statement calling it precautionary and routine. The statement had 3 spelling errors in it, which I noticed because that's the kind of thing I notice. Next morning, the smell was stronger. I drove toward Asheville on I-26. I got as far as the Tunnel Road exit before traffic stopped completely. Not slow traffic, stopped traffic. The kind where people get out of their cars and stand in the road looking at each other. I sat in my truck for about 20 minutes, watching the people ahead of me get increasingly agitated, until a woman came running down the shoulder from the direction of Asheville, and she was screaming something I couldn't make out over her own panic. A man a few cars ahead of me tried to help her, and she went for his face. Just went for his face. No warning, nothing verbal. She bit the side of his jaw, and he screamed, and she didn't stop. I put my truck in reverse. That took a lot of maneuvering because there were cars behind me, but I got the truck onto the grass median, and I drove the wrong way down the shoulder until I could find an exit. Behind me, while I was doing this, I could hear more screaming. Not the traffic noise you'd expect, the other kind. I got off at the Enka exit and drove west. I filled my tank at a pilot station outside of Canton. The pump still worked. The attendant was a kid who looked stunned, staring at his phone, and I bought everything the station's convenience store had that was worth buying. 2 gallons of water, 3 bags of beef jerky, a box of granola bars, 2 lighters, a 12-pack of AAA batteries, pork rinds, which I don't even like, but there was nothing else left. The kid behind the counter didn't argue about the quantity. He barely looked up. I called my office, got voicemail, called my boss's cell, got voicemail, called my sister in Charlotte. It rang 7 times and then went to voicemail. I left a message. Something about don't go outside, lock the doors. I don't know. I was still processing. I sat in the pilot parking lot for about 15 minutes, watching the road. 3 cars went past, heading east toward Asheville. 1 car went past going west, moving fast. A man walked by on foot who didn't seem to be in a hurry, except that he was walking in the wrong lane of traffic and his left arm was hanging at an angle that wasn't right. I watched him in my rearview mirror until he was out of sight. Then I started the truck and drove to the Forest Service road outside of Brevard. It wasn't a rational decision. I mean, nothing about the next several hours was rational in any planned, premeditated sense. But I want to be clear that I didn't drive to the estate out of some brilliant survival instinct. I drove there because I didn't know where else to go. I drove there because I had a GPS coordinate in my field notebook, and that seemed like the most solid thing I had. The access road to the estate was gated. The main entrance gate, the one with the property management notice on it from months ago, now had a chain and padlock through it. I cut it with the bolt cutters I keep in my truck for field work, for exactly the kind of situation where I need to access terrain through a locked gate, and drove through. I replaced the chain behind me. Old surveyor habit. Leave things as you found them. The gravel drive wound up through stands of pine and eastern hemlock for about 3/4 of a mile before it reached the main house. I didn't stop at the house. I went around the north side of the main house, through the open field where the perennial garden used to be, and followed the ridge trail up toward the back 40. I parked where the trail ended and hiked the rest. Same route as before. Same 40-minute climb. By the time I got to the flat shelf, my heart was doing something that wasn't quite normal. And I'm not a person who gets easily scared, so let me just say the heart thing was notable. The keypad was there. LED was green. I tried the obvious things first. 0 through 9 in sequence. The house's county tax parcel number, which I remembered from the assessment documents. The year the estate was first deeded, 1987. Nothing. Then I tried the first 6 digits of the GPS coordinates of the spot itself, which I know sounds strange, but when someone is a certain type of obsessive and wants to make a code that's accessible only to someone who actually did the legwork of finding the location, that's the kind of code they'd use. And I was right, or lucky, or both. The panel swung inward on hydraulic hinges. Behind it was a steel door, reinforced, set into a formed concrete frame. The door had a second keypad and a biometric reader. The biometric reader was a palm scanner. I put my hand on it, expecting nothing, and the door didn't open. I stood there for a moment, outside, in the dark because it was past 7 p.m. now, and I'd burned an hour and a half getting here from the highway. Down on the ridge below me, I could see the glow from Brevard, still there. Still orange and normal, not the sick orange of things burning. Good, or at least, not bad yet. Next to the palm scanner, there was a number display, backlit, that said, Secondary Access, Enter Override Code, and below it, in smaller text, Emergency Protocols Active. Emergency Protocols, Active, without me doing anything to activate them. Which meant this system was already running on whatever its emergency setting was. Which meant it had triggered automatically, which meant someone or something had told it to. I typed in the GPS coordinates again. Nothing. I typed in the tax parcel number. Nothing. I typed in 1987. Nothing. I sat down on the concrete threshold and thought for a while. The thing about biometric security combined with override codes is that the override is usually designed to be accessible to someone who isn't the primary user, an estate manager, a maintenance crew, someone who needs to get in during an emergency when the primary user isn't available, which means the code isn't private and personal, it's institutional. It's something a company representative would be given. I still had the original contract paperwork from the environmental assessment in my truck, accessible on my tablet. The contract number was BVM 20190047, 7 digits. I typed it in. The door opened. The smell that came out was climate-controlled air, with a faint underlayer of something mechanical. Generator exhaust filtered through a serious ventilation system, the kind that vents nowhere obvious. Cool and dry, maybe 65 degrees inside the tunnel. The tunnel itself was about 8 feet wide and 7 feet tall. Poured concrete walls with embedded LED lighting that kicked on automatically when I stepped through. The floor was painted steel grating over a drainage channel. I walked in. The door swung shut behind me. I'm going to be honest. For about 10 seconds, I had a complete internal crisis about that. The door closing, the outside disappearing. But the inside of the door had a manual release handle, obvious, labeled. The kind of thing that's there because whoever designed this knew people would panic. And I tried it, and it opened. So I closed it again and walked forward. The tunnel was 60 feet long and sloped downward at roughly an 8% grade. At the end was a steel-grated staircase, descending another 2 stories. I went down. At the bottom was an airlock-style anteroom, maybe 10 by 10 feet, with a second door ahead of me and benches on both sides with hooks above them. A decontamination shower head mounted in the ceiling, currently off. Signs on the wall explaining decon procedures in case of biological exposure. The signs were laminated and professional, not homemade. Someone had designed these years before any emergency. I went through the second door, and I was inside. My first impression, it was bigger than I expected, and I'd been trying to prepare myself for something significant. The main room was what I'd later come to call the hub, circular, maybe 40 feet in diameter, with corridors radiating off it like spokes. 7 corridors in total. The ceiling in the hub was 14 feet high and had an indirect lighting system that mimicked natural daylight, the kind you see in expensive offices or growth chambers. The floor was polished concrete. In the center there was a cluster of workstations, monitors, keyboards, what turned out to be a satellite communications array, arranged in a loose semicircle facing a curved wall of screens. 7 of the screens were showing external camera feeds. I stood in front of those screens for a long time. Camera 1 was the main gate from the estate's entrance. Camera 2 was the front of the main house. Cameras 3 and 4 were the rear grounds. Camera 5 was the ridge trail below the compound entrance. Camera 6 was the Forest Service road at the edge of the property. Camera 7 was showing a feed from somewhere I didn't recognize. A residential street in what looked like a small town. Buildings I didn't know. A pharmacy sign on the corner. A feed from somewhere outside the estate entirely. A street that was currently very empty in a way that made me feel cold. 2 of the external cameras were showing static. Not interference static, dead camera static. They'd gone dark at some point. I looked at the feeds for a while. Nothing moved on any of them except the trees on camera 5, moving in the wind. The pharmacy street was still. The main house was dark. Everything was normal except for the way my chest felt looking at it. I found the light switch panel. I turned on 1 corridor at a time, slowly, before going into any of them. I wanted to know what was where before I committed to anything. 3 of the corridors had automatic lights that kicked on with motion sensors. 4 of them needed manual switching. Over the next 2 hours, I did a slow, methodical walkthrough of every accessible space. There was a lot of accessible space. Corridor 1 led to what I'd call the residential section. 8 individual sleeping rooms, each about 10 by 12 feet, each with a built-in bunk, a small desk, a storage locker. Basic, but not grim. The mattresses were vacuum-sealed in plastic. The lockers were empty in 7 of the rooms. The 8th room's locker was not empty. It had clothing in it. Men's clothing, quality stuff, folded neatly. 3 pairs of cargo pants, several long-sleeved shirts, a fleece layer, a set of thermal base layers still in packaging. Work boots in the corner. A rain jacket on the hook above the locker. And on the desk, a notebook. Not a journal, more like a planning document. I opened it. On the first page, in handwriting that was precise and angular, someone had written, "Personal Kit, Phase 1 Deployment." Below that was a checklist. Most items on the checklist had check marks next to them. The last item on the checklist said, Confirm comm relay is operational. It was not checked. I closed the notebook and put it back exactly as I'd found it. I don't know why that instinct kicked in. It just felt important to not disturb anything until I understood where I was. Corridor 2, the kitchen and food stores. This was where I stopped walking quickly and started standing very still, the way you do when something overwhelms a basic expectation. The kitchen itself was commercial grade. A 4-burner gas range, a large refrigerator, running, cold, empty, which made sense if no one had stocked it recently. A chest freezer, running, also empty. A large stainless work counter, full set of pots and pans hung on a rack. Water supply from a tank that turned out to have a 1,500-gallon capacity, currently at about 70%. But the food wasn't in the kitchen. The food was in the room behind the kitchen. A dry storage room about 20 feet long and 12 feet wide, with ceiling-to-floor steel shelving units along all 4 walls and a central island of shelving. And those shelves were full. Not stocked normally full, the way a well-prepared person might have a pantry. Full in a way that took me a while to actually process. Canned goods going back 7 or 8 years based on the best buy dates I checked. Beans, vegetables, proteins, soups, everything. Along with vacuum-sealed grains, freeze-dried vegetables, protein powder, sugar, salt, cooking oil in sealed jugs. The shelf closest to the door had a complete printed inventory taped to it, organized by category and quantity. I stood there reading the inventory for probably 10 minutes. If I was eating about 2,000 calories a day, which was a reasonable estimate for a sedentary to moderately active person living underground, this room held enough food for a single person for roughly 3 years, maybe a bit more, depending on how careful I was with the rationing. The inventory confirmed this. It was designed for 8 people for 1 year, meaning 1 person for 8 years, theoretically. 8 years. I went back to the hub and sat down at one of the workstations and looked at the external camera feeds for a while. Corridor 3, medical. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because the specifics are hard to fully inventory, but a room with 2 hospital-grade beds, a surgical light, a crash cart with a full complement of emergency medications, a cabinet with pharmaceuticals that included antibiotics, antivirals, pain management, and several things I didn't immediately recognize. An autoclave, a basic set of surgical instruments in sealed packaging, a medical reference library on a shelving unit, printed books, not digital, organized by category. The most worn spine on the shelf was a surgical manual. I looked at the publication date. It was recent. Someone had been using it. Corridor 4, mechanical. The generator room, which I could hear humming slightly through the wall. 3 diesel generators in a staggered setup. If one failed, a second would automatically kick over. Fuel tank reads that I checked showed over 3,000 gallons of diesel on hand, stored in an underground tank beneath the room. The ventilation system, a water filtration and recycling setup, a gray water handling system, a small workshop space with a metal fabrication bench, and a decent collection of hand and power tools. Corridor 5 was locked. The door was steel, and significantly heavier than the other doors in the facility. It had its own keypad. The door also had, at floor level on the inside edge, something I noticed only because I crouched to check the door seal. A small amount of dried material that might have been food, or might have been something else. Rust-colored. I didn't touch it. I noted Corridor 5 and moved on. Corridor 6, communications and library. This room had a satellite uplink system, a ham radio setup, and a shortwave receiver. Banks of hard drives. 2 workstations with current software on them, and along 3 walls, an actual library. Hundreds of books, organized by subject. Agriculture, water management, electrical engineering, medicine, political philosophy, botany, history. Several shelves of fiction. This was the room that told me the most about who Aldous Pemberton was, because a person's library is a self-portrait whether they intend it to be or not. He'd read widely and obsessively, and had underlined things extensively. I pulled a book at random, a treatise on pandemic preparedness from 2005, and the margins were dense with his angular handwriting. And Corridor 7, which I won't describe in detail yet, because I didn't fully understand what I was looking at for another 3 weeks. The last thing I found that first night, after walking through everything, was a journal. Not the planning document from the bedroom locker, an actual journal, Pemberton's own, sitting on the workstation in the hub, cover facing up, a pen clipped to the elastic band. The last entry was dated about 4 months before I arrived. I opened it and read the last page. The last entry said, "The reports from the WHO field team in eastern Guangdong are consistent with what the independent lab analysis showed in January. Accelerated incubation window, neurological cascade, within 48 to 72 hours of primary infection. The immune response data suggests prior exposure is not protective. No natural immunity in any documented case. This isn't the variant we modeled for. This is worse. I need to think about phase 2. And then, below that, a single additional sentence written at an angle, not like the rest of the entry, more like an afterthought. If someone else finds this before me, read from the beginning. I slept that first night in the residential section, in room 3. Not room 8, where someone else's things were. I didn't touch those. I found a sleeping bag in a storage locker in the mechanical corridor, several of them, still vacuum sealed, and I slept in my clothes with my boots on and the journal on the floor next to me. I was awake for a long time before I slept. The compound was quiet in a specific way that I've since gotten used to, but that first night felt like pressure. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of a particular kind of noise. The generator's low hum, carried through the concrete, in a frequency that you felt more than heard. The ventilation system's whisper. And below all of that, occasionally, something that I initially dismissed as the ventilation fans, but which I eventually identified as the sound of the earth itself. The mountain settling, differential temperature changes in the rock, the creek somewhere below making its way through whatever aquifer layer was down there. No sounds from outside, no wind, no birds, no traffic. I didn't know yet how much I would come to miss those sounds. The next morning, and I knew it was morning, only because my watch said 6:43 a.m., I did the first practical thing. I went to the communication room and tried everything. The satellite uplink was active and had a signal. I spent about 30 minutes figuring out the interface, which was not designed for intuitive public use, but was at least documented in a binder sitting on the shelf next to the workstation. I got it to a point where I could receive data. The data I received was fragmentary. News feeds, emergency broadcast system signals, a few amateur radio transmissions, but it was enough. By the time I finished reading and listening, I'd been at the communication station for 2 hours, and I had to sit back from the screen for a while and not look at anything. Asheville was gone. I don't mean destroyed in a fire or a bomb. I mean gone in the way that a city goes gone, when its systems stop working and its people stop being people. The broadcast fragments were inconsistent, and some of them were days old, and a few seemed to be automated emergency signals running on backup power, with no one left to update them. But the picture they assembled, taken together, was clear enough. The infection had moved faster than any of the official models had predicted. Charlotte was in a similar state. Atlanta had gone dark 2 days prior. The federal emergency broadcasting system was still running, but the language in the broadcasts had shifted. The early ones were specific and directive. This is what you should do. Here is where to go. Here is who to contact. And the more recent ones were vague. They said things like maintain shelter in place and avoid contact with infected individuals and await further instructions. The further instructions part was the tell. When authorities say await further instructions, what they mean is we don't have instructions. We're waiting too. I made myself eat something, a can of beans heated on the gas range, which felt absurd and normal at the same time. And then I started reading Pemberton's journal from the beginning. Aldous Pemberton, I learned over the next several weeks as I worked through his journals, was 63 years old and had made most of his money in pharmaceutical distribution in the 1990s, before selling his stakes and shifting into what he called capital preservation in non-correlated asset classes, which as far as I could tell, meant he bought land, paid very little tax on it, and spent the returns on specific obsessions. He'd been buying remote land since 2001. The mountain estate was the fourth property he'd purchased for this purpose, and it was the one he'd chosen for the compound because of the granite base layer. Excellent for construction stability and natural radiation shielding, the journals noted, and the proximity to a year-round water source. He'd started building the compound in 2003. It took 5 years. He used 4 separate contractors for different phases, none of whom had visibility into what the others were doing. The project was managed under the name of an LLC that didn't mention his name. The legal trust that had hired me for the environmental assessment was 2 layers of corporate structure away from him. He was meticulous. The journals, and there were 9 of them, covering 20 years, showed a man who thought in very long timelines and with a very specific flavor of paranoia that was not quite like any flavor of paranoia I'd encountered before. He wasn't afraid of nuclear war. He wasn't afraid of economic collapse or government overreach. He was afraid, specifically, and with detailed reasoning, of biological emergence events. He'd been afraid of it since 1995, when a paper on filovirus hemorrhagic fever that he'd read in a publication he described only as the Private Quarterly had convinced him that the global population's lack of coordinated biosurveillance represented a permanent and escalating existential risk. He wasn't crazy. That's what I want to say clearly. The journals were the product of a very unusual mind, and there were passages that read as obsessive in a way that probably wasn't healthy, and there was a loneliness to them that got harder to read as the years went on. But the analysis was sound. He'd been tracking outbreak data from WHO, from independent field teams he funded through a research foundation, from a network of contacts he referred to by first initial only, B, who seemed to be some kind of virologist, K, who appeared to be connected to a government laboratory, F, who sent him raw field reports from Asia. He'd modeled 17 different outbreak scenarios over 10 years. He'd revised his models as new data came in. He'd built this compound based on the models. And then sometime in the previous year, the data coming in had stopped matching any of his models. He'd written about this with a particular kind of dread, not panicked, because this was a man who didn't seem to do panic, but with a deliberate, careful, escalating alarm that was worse than panic in some ways. The entries from 6 months before I arrived were almost daily. He was cross-referencing field reports from 3 continents. He was tracking the spread of something he never named directly in the journals, referring to it only as the cascade event or the emergence, as though naming it specifically would be bad luck or would make it more real. The last entries described him preparing to come to the compound. He'd been in London, apparently, for the previous 8 months. He had a residence there, mentioned in passing a few times. He was going to fly home. He had arrangements made. Everything was planned. And then the last entry was the one I'd already read. The reports are consistent with what the independent lab showed. Accelerated incubation, neurological cascade. This isn't the variant we modeled for. He'd written that entry from London. He hadn't made it back. Day 3 inside the compound. I want to say I had things figured out by then, that I'd processed and adapted and made a rational plan. I hadn't. Mostly I read. I ate. I slept too much. Then not enough. I spent hours in the communications room cycling through whatever signals I could pick up, piecing together what was happening outside, and then I'd feel overwhelmed by what I was piecing together, and I'd go sit in the hub and stare at the external camera feeds. The feeds showed me the main gate, undisturbed. The front of the house, undisturbed. The ridge trail, which was empty. The pharmacy street from the exterior camera, which was occasionally not empty. On day 3, I watched for 45 minutes as 7 infected moved down that pharmacy street. They were slow. They walked in that specific way that, once you'd seen it, you couldn't mistake for normal human walking, a kind of looseness in the joints, a slight forward list, the head not tracking in the way a person's head tracks when they're navigating through space. They were reacting to sound. A car alarm going off somewhere out of frame was pulling them toward it, and they went past the pharmacy camera in a cluster, shoulder to shoulder in a loose way, more like debris carried by current than like a group of people with intent. I watched them until they moved out of frame. I noted in my own notebook, I'd found a spiral-bound one in the library corridor. The date, the time, and the count. 7. And then, no signs of coordination. React to sound, not visual. Loose joint presentation. No interaction with each other. This is what I do. I observe. I note. It keeps my brain occupied. On day 4, I started cataloging the food stores properly, counting actual units against the printed inventory to check for discrepancies. There were none in the canned goods. There were some in the dry goods. The inventory listed 60 pounds of rolled oats, but I could only account for about 48 pounds when I actually weighed what was on the shelves. Not a huge discrepancy. Could have been a packaging error at the manufacturer. Could have been something else. I noted the discrepancy and moved on. Day 5. The first thing went wrong. The ventilation system threw an error code around 3 p.m. I don't know exactly what time because I'd started being looser about checking the clock by then, which was probably the first sign of drift. The error code showed up on the control panel in the hub as a yellow warning light and a 3-digit code I didn't recognize. I found the ventilation system manual in the mechanical corridor, found the code in the troubleshooting section, determined that it indicated a sensor fault on the secondary inlet duct, not a system failure, just a sensor that had stopped reporting correctly, probably a calibration issue. I followed the manual's diagnostic procedure, reset the sensor's calibration module from the control panel, and the warning cleared in about 20 minutes. But those 20 minutes were interesting, because the ventilation system, while I was running the diagnostic, was reduced to about 60% flow. The compound is large enough that 60% flow is still technically adequate, but I noticed it. The air felt slightly more still, slightly more used, like the oxygen content wasn't quite the same. It probably was fine. It probably was my brain filling in anxiety where there was no technical basis for it. I noted the sensor ID, the error code, the time, and the resolution procedure. I started keeping a maintenance log. I figured Pemberton would have wanted one. Day 7, I found what I'd been starting to suspect was there. I'd been circling corridor 5 in my head since the first night. The locked door with the heavy steel and the separate keypad. The dried rust-colored material on the floor seal. I'd tried several code combinations over the previous days, and nothing had worked. On day 7, I found, in the library corridor, a red binder labeled Operations, compartmentalized, that I'd initially overlooked because it was wedged between 2 thick agricultural manuals, and its red cover was only partially visible. Inside the binder was a table of contents for all 7 corridors. Corridor 5 was labeled Biological Containment, Research, and below the label, in Pemberton's handwriting, a note, Access restricted to credentialed personnel. Primary code on file with B. Emergency access. C sequence in Communications Log Delta. I found Communications Log Delta in the communications room. It was a printed binder of communications, emails mostly, formatted for print, between Pemberton and his various contacts. The Delta series were communications with B, who turned out to be a woman named Dr. Becca Voss, identified in one of the email headers as being affiliated with a private biosafety laboratory in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. The communications were technical and dense, involving a lot of terminology I'm not qualified to fully evaluate. Virology, specifically, with emphasis on aerosol transmission dynamics, and something called neurotropic viral binding affinity. The emergency access sequence for Corridor 5 was at the back of the Delta binder. It was 7T71239. I stood outside Corridor 5's door for a while. I thought about the rust-colored material on the floor seal. I thought about what biological containment research meant in the context of everything else I'd learned about what Pemberton was preparing for. Then I went back to the hub and had something to eat, and thought about it some more. I went back the next morning. I typed in 771239. The door opened. The room was smaller than I expected, maybe 15 by 20 feet. It had a different quality of finish than the rest of the compound, more sterile, more intentional, with sealed lighting fixtures and smooth epoxy floor coating and seamless wall panels. Against the far wall was a negative pressure containment cabinet, the kind used in biosafety level 3 laboratory settings, currently not running. 2 laboratory workbenches with standard equipment, microscopes, centrifuge, specimen storage refrigerators currently plugged in and at temperature, a chemical storage cabinet with a digital lock. There was a laptop on the nearer workbench, open, powered up, not on sleep mode. The screen was showing an active document. Someone had been in this room recently enough that the laptop screen hadn't gone to sleep. The document was a spreadsheet, columns of numbers, dates, observations. I looked at the most recent entries. The most recent date in the spreadsheet was 11 days before I arrived. 11 days before I arrived, someone had been sitting at this laptop, logging data. I stood very still in the middle of corridor 5 for a while. Then I looked around the room more carefully. There were small things I'd missed in the first sweep. A coffee mug on the second workbench, a ring of dried coffee inside it, a folded piece of paper on the floor near the door, partially under the edge of the bench, the kind of thing that falls without the person noticing, a single latex glove, used, sitting on top of the chemical storage cabinet. I picked up the folded paper from the floor. It was a handwritten note, not to anyone, not addressed, not signed. It said, "Sample integrity compromised. Refrigeration failure suspected between transport and storage. Running secondary analysis to confirm. If confirmed, reporting to," and then it stopped. Just stopped, mid-sentence. The pen had dragged when it stopped, leaving a short tail at the end of the word to, like the person writing it had been interrupted, or had left in a hurry. Seleni. I spent the rest of day 8 in the communications room, going through the Delta binder more carefully. The emails between Pemberton and Dr. Voss went back 4 years. They started as something that looked like a professional consulting relationship. He was paying her lab to run analyses. She was delivering reports. They became, over time, something more personal, though not in a romantic sense. More like the kind of relationship that forms between two people who are both looking at the same very bad thing and can only really talk to each other about it. By the last year of the communications, Voss was sending him raw data, not polished reports. She was sending him things she clearly wasn't supposed to share. In one email from 9 months before my arrival, she wrote, "The sequencing results from the 3rd sample series are impossible to explain by natural mutation rates. Someone worked on this. I don't know how to say that more plainly. The characteristics I'm seeing are not what you get from evolutionary pressure alone. I'm scared." And Pemberton's response, "I know. Come to the compound. I mean this. Come when you're ready, and don't wait too long." The next email in the series, 3 weeks later, was Voss writing, "I'm ready. I'm sorry it took me this long. I'll drive. I don't want to fly." I closed the binder. I sat back from the workstation. Voss had come here. She'd been here 11 days before me, running analyses in corridor 5, and then she'd left, in what the partial note suggested was a hurry. Where had she gone? I didn't know. I had no way to know, and she might be fine, or she might be dead, or she might be whatever the infected were. I sat with not knowing that for a while, because not knowing is something I've had to get better at over the past months, and this was early practice. One other thing in the communications log, a separate section of emails, not between Pemberton and Voss. These were between Pemberton and Kay, the government contact. They were shorter, less frequent, and more guarded. The most recent one, from about 8 months before my arrival, was 3 sentences long. It said, "The models I've been asked to brief on are wrong. The timeline is weeks, not months. You need to be where you need to be." That was Kay's message. Pemberton's response wasn't logged. Maybe he'd never responded. Maybe he'd just started packing. 3 weeks in. This is roughly where I've been recording from, where I opened this camera feed and started talking. Let me catch the record up to now, and then I'll go forward in real time as things happen. Week 2 was mostly establishing and cataloging. I organized the food stores by type and calculated consumption rates. I set up a rotation schedule for the generators. Diesel consumption is something I have to track carefully, because 3,000 gallons sounds like a lot, until you do the math on 3 generators running full time, at which point it becomes not that long. I put 2 of the generators on standby and run the facility mostly off 1, which reduced consumption dramatically. The trade-off is that I have to monitor the active generator more carefully. I set a maintenance alarm. I also started exploring the compound's ventilation infrastructure more thoroughly, not out of paranoia, but because understanding the physical structure of the place felt important. The ventilation shafts are narrow, 8 inches in most sections, but they connect to the surface in 2 places, both of which are hidden under false boulders, similar to the main entrance. I located both exits on the surface, one about 40 feet north of the main entrance, and one further down the ridge, maybe 200 feet, near a rock formation I'd noted in my original survey. Both exits were closed and sealed from inside. Good, that mattered. I also found the escape tunnels. They weren't in any of the documentation I'd read up to that point. The operations binder didn't mention them. The engineering drawings in the mechanical room showed the utility runs, but not these. I found them by accident when I was measuring the interior dimensions of the compound against the ridge terrain above, trying to understand the overall geometry of the facility. The interior measurements didn't add up. There was space unaccounted for. Not a small margin, but a significant discrepancy. Maybe 20 feet of passage running roughly east from the residential section. I found the access point in the laundry room adjacent to the residential section, a floor panel under the washing machine, which was on a rail and could be slid aside. Below the panel, a ladder into a concrete passage. The passage ran east for about 80 feet and then split. One branch going north, one going south. Both branches ended in steel ladder shafts going up. I climbed the north shaft first. At the top, a steel hatch, locked from below with a manual slide bolt. I didn't open it then, because I was alone and had no idea what was directly above the hatch, and that seemed like a bad time to find out. I came back down and climbed the south shaft. Same situation. Hatch at the top, locked from below. I noted the location of both hatches. I checked them weekly after that, making sure the bolts were tight. They became part of my mental map of the place, the kind of thing you're aware of, even when you're not actively thinking about it. What I was actively thinking about, through most of week 2, was Corridor 5. Voss had left something in that spreadsheet. I kept going back to it. The columns were labeled Sample ID, Acquisition Date, Processing Date, Analysis Type, Result Code, Notes. The Notes column was where the actual information was, and the actual information was terrifying, in a way that was also clarifying, if that makes sense. Sometimes things that scare you are also things that help you understand, and this was one of those. She'd been analyzing tissue samples. Not blood, not fluid. Tissue. She'd acquired them in batches, the acquisition dates ranging over several months. The result codes were unfamiliar to me, but consistent within the data set. Whatever she was seeing it repeatedly, and her notes on the later entries had a quality of tired confirmation, like she'd been hoping to find something different, and kept not finding it. One note said, same presentation as batch 6, 12, and 14. Neurotropic binding, consistent with earlier samples. No degradation in sample. Note, sample preserved at room temperature for 72 hours prior to processing. No degradation. I understood enough of this to understand why the last sentence was underlined. Normal organic tissue degrades. Normal organic tissue at room temperature for 72 hours doesn't look like the note suggested this tissue looked. The implication was that whatever was happening at a cellular level in infected tissue was not operating by the rules that normally apply to dead cells. I don't know the virology. I don't have Voss's training. But the underline on that sentence told me everything I needed to know about how she felt about what she'd found. Day 23. I'm recording this at what the clock calls 9 p.m., after what I've decided to call dinner, though it was actually lunch, because I slept through the morning after a bad night. Bad night, meaning I woke up at about 2 a.m., to a sound I couldn't identify, a low, rhythmic vibration that turned out to be a loose fitting in the ventilation system that I found, and tightened within about 40 minutes. But those 40 minutes between waking and finding the source were the most genuinely scared I've been so far. Alone, underground, 3 in the morning, with an unidentified sound that you can feel in the walls. I lay back down and didn't sleep again until close to 6 a.m., hence, sleeping through the morning. The external cameras showed nothing interesting today. The pharmacy street had one infected moving through it, around what I estimated was noon, based on the light, though the camera quality makes it hard to tell exactly. It was moving north. It disappeared out of frame after about 3 minutes. The other cameras were all clear. I've been thinking about Voss's partial note, the one I found on the floor of Corridor 5. If confirmed, reporting to who? Not to Pemberton, clearly, because Pemberton was in London and presumably never made it here. There was someone she planned to contact, or intended to tell. That means she had another contact, someone not captured in any of the communications I've read. Or maybe she was reporting to herself, a note to herself, as in, if the results confirm, I need to document this formally, but that reading doesn't fit the grammar. Reporting to someone. I have the ham radio in the communications room. I haven't used it. I've been using the satellite uplink to receive, but I haven't transmitted anything. I have reasons for this that I've been over several times. 1. Transmitting reveals your position to anyone with the right equipment. 2. I don't know who's out there, listening. 3. The people out there could include people who would come here looking for exactly what this compound has. These are all good reasons. I've been sitting with them for 3 weeks, and they're still good reasons. But I've also been 3 weeks completely alone underground, and the specific quality of loneliness this produces is something I don't have great language for. It's not sadness, exactly. It's more like the feeling of being a signal with no receiver. I'm going to give it a little longer. Not much longer, but a little. Day 26. Something happened on the surface cameras today that I need to document. At approximately 3:30 p.m., the camera covering the ridge trail, camera 5, picked up movement. Not infected movement. A person, upright, walking carefully, with the deliberate foot placement of someone who's been moving quietly through terrain for a while. Heavy coat, pack on their back, something in their right hand I couldn't identify through the camera resolution, but which might have been a walking stick or a long tool of some kind. They came up the ridge trail and stopped about 50 feet below the compound entrance. Stood there, seemed to be looking at the rock outcropping from below. From that distance, the artificial stone panel wouldn't be obviously artificial. I know this because I assessed it from that angle myself during the original survey. It would look like rock. The person stood there for maybe 2 minutes. Then they turned around and went back down the trail. I sat at the monitors for another hour after that, watching. Nothing else appeared on any of the cameras. A person, a living person who wasn't infected, moving carefully, looking at this part of the ridge. I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't, exactly, but I'm thinking about it. Day 29. 2 things. First, I spent most of the previous 3 days working through more of Pemberton's journals, specifically the most recent 2, volumes 8 and 9, which were more focused on operational planning and less on analysis. He'd been through dozens of what he called trigger scenarios, meaning the specific conditions under which he would initiate his move to the compound. Most of the scenarios he'd planned for involved weeks or months of warning, deteriorating public health indicators, governmental response failures, that kind of thing. He'd built in decision trees for each trigger scenario. He'd pre-positioned a car at a storage facility 40 miles from the estate, with fuel and supplies, specifically so he'd have a backup transport option if his primary route was compromised. He'd thought of almost everything. What he hadn't planned for, or at least hadn't written about, was an outbreak that moved fast enough to eliminate the warning period entirely. The neurological cascade he'd written about in his last entry, the 48-72-hour window from exposure to full presentation, was a key difference from the variants he'd modeled. His models assumed a longer incubation, which would give him time to recognize the situation and move. A 48-72-hour window meant someone could be in London, going about their ordinary life, get exposed on a Monday, and by Wednesday afternoon, they were no longer themselves. No time to arrange a flight, no time to reach the car in storage, no time for any of the decision tree he'd carefully built. He'd built a perfect shelter. He just couldn't get to it in time. I sat with that for a long time. Second thing, I found, tucked inside the back cover of Volume 9, a handwritten note, Different paper from the rest of the journal, torn from a regular spiral-bound notebook. Not the quality stock he wrote the journals in. The handwriting was not Pemberton's angular precision. It was someone else's, rounded, hurried, under pressure when it was written. It said, A. Supplies confirmed. Phase 2 inventory complete as of March 14th. The sealed section is not for biological research. Please read the Section 7 directive in the operations manual. If you are reading this and you are not A, do not open the sealed section. I mean this. I've left further instructions in the greenhouse. No signature. The date on the note was March 14th, 11 days before I arrived. Voss had been here on March 14. This was her note. She'd written it to Pemberton, A, as in Aldous, and then hidden it in the journal where she assumed he'd find it when he arrived, which he never did, because he never made it. She'd also written it as a warning to anyone else who found it. Do not open the sealed section. I'd already opened Corridor 5. I'd been in there twice. I was fine, apparently. The biological containment cabinet was sealed and powered down. I'd been careful not to touch anything I didn't need to touch. But now I had a new variable. The sealed section in Voss's note might not have been Corridor 5. It might have been something else, something she was referring to specifically. I went back through the compound looking for anything I'd identified as sealed and hadn't yet accessed. I found it in Corridor 7. Corridor 7. I've mentioned it but not described it. It was the last corridor I'd initially explored, the one farthest from the hub, running south. The corridor itself was unremarkable. Concrete floor, LED lighting, storage shelving along the left side, holding general supplies, hardware, spare parts. At the end of the corridor, a door. A standard compound door like the others. Steel, but not reinforced, with a keypad. What I hadn't noticed on the first pass, because it was dark at the far end, and the overhead light in that section had a dead bulb that I hadn't replaced yet, was that the door had been modified. Not by Pemberton, or at least not in the original construction. Someone had added a secondary lock after the fact. A dead bolt, installed in the door's lower third, with the barrel on the corridor side. From the corridor side, you could slide the dead bolt to lock it. From whatever was on the other side of the door, you couldn't. This door had been locked from the outside. I stood in front of it for a long time. I tried the keypad. The same codes I'd used elsewhere. Nothing worked. The door stayed locked. I also noticed, for the first time, a detail I'd completely missed in my first pass. The base of this door, at the gap between door and floor, had a rubber seal on it. Heavy, deliberate, an airtight seal. An airtight seal is something you put on a door when you don't want what's inside to come out. I backed away from the door, went back to the hub, and sat down with the operations manual. The operations manual had been in the mechanical room, on a shelf of equipment documentation, and I'd read most of it in the first week. Mostly practical maintenance information for all the facility systems. I hadn't read it in full because, honestly, some of it was deeply technical in ways that weren't immediately relevant, and I'd prioritized what seemed actionable. Section 7 was labeled Contingency Archive, chronological, and it was 40 pages of dense, organized documentation. It was a backup record, a redundant archive of everything Pemberton had built and planned and prepared for. The reason it was in this section, the reason it warranted a separate sealed room, was not the information itself. It was what the information was stored on. The final page of Section 7 was titled Biological Sample Archive, Rationale and Conditions, and it said, "The sealed section in Corridor 7 contains an archival repository of biological specimens, maintained at controlled temperature, assembled in collaboration with Dr. R. Voss. The collection includes 38 primary tissue samples, representing 6 identified pathogen variants, 4 unidentified variants, and 3 samples of indeterminate classification. The collection also includes preserved serum samples from 4 individuals, representing potential partial resistance profiles." Partial resistance. There were 4 people, somewhere in Pemberton's documentation, who showed some partial resistance to what was spreading outside. The samples from those people were behind that door. The documentation continued. The specimens are maintained in negative pressure sealed containers and pose no risk under normal circumstances. However, conditions of prolonged power interruption, temperature variance exceeding 20 degrees Fahrenheit from set point, or physical disturbance to the containment vessels may result in exposure risk. In the event of a long-term occupation scenario where the primary researcher is not present, this room must remain sealed. I put the operations manual down on the workstation and looked at the door to Corridor 7 from across the hub. The seal on Corridor 7's door was intact. The dead bolt I'd added, or that Voss had added, was engaged. The room was locked. The generators were running normally. The temperature in that corridor was stable. It could stay locked. I could just let it stay locked. And yet, those serum samples from 4 individuals with partial resistance. Voss had collected them, processed them, brought them here. She'd written her results in a spreadsheet in Corridor 5. If that information was in the specimen archive behind that door, if there was clinical data, analytical notes, anything that explained what partial resistance meant, that was potentially important information. I left the door locked. I'm not stupid. Day 31. This is today. Back to the beginning of this recording. It's 6:47 in the morning by the control room clock, and I've been awake for the last 2 hours because of something I heard. About 2 hours ago, I was in my sleeping room, half awake the way I usually am now, from maybe 4 a.m. onward. I heard something on the ventilation system. Not the loose fitting, not the settling rock. Something different. A rhythm that wasn't mechanical. I lay very still and listened for about 3 minutes. The ventilation pulls air from 2 surface intakes, the 2 hidden locations I found in week 2. Sound travels through the duct system in specific ways, directional, attenuated by distance, muffled by the filter banks. But certain sounds carry further than others, impact sounds, vibration sounds. What I heard was footsteps, the sound of a person's weight on ground over the duct intake. Someone was standing on or very near the north surface intake, about 40 feet from the compound entrance. Not infected footsteps. I've listened to infected movement enough through these walls to know what it sounds like. The dragging shuffling, the irregular rhythm of the loose-jointed walk. This was a normal human walking pattern. Deliberate. Someone trying to move quietly, and mostly succeeding but not perfectly. I heard it for about 4 minutes, and then it stopped. I'm at the control room now, watching cameras. The ridge trail camera is showing nothing. The area around the compound entrance, as best I can see from camera 5's angle, shows nothing. But someone was up there, standing over one of my air intakes, at 4 in the morning. I'm going to go up there today and check. Not blindly. I'm going to spend a few hours watching the cameras first, and I'm going to think carefully about what I bring and how I approach the surface. I've spent 31 days underground, and I'm going to have to go outside eventually. I've known this. The question was always when and why. The answer, apparently, is today, and because something is happening out there that I need to see for myself. But first, I need to eat something and think through this properly. Because the one thing I can control right now is whether I do this smart or stupid, and I'm choosing smart. I went up at what the clock called 11 a.m., which meant the sun would be at its highest, and the ridge would be getting enough light to see clearly. I came up through the main entrance, the one in the rock face, rather than one of the escape hatches, because the main entrance gives me the option to retreat quickly and close the reinforced door. The escape hatches don't have that option. I brought the folding knife I found in the mechanical room's tool cabinet, a pry bar, a headlamp with fresh batteries, the notebook, that's all, nothing heavy. I pressed the manual release, cracked the outer door, and listened for 30 seconds before opening it fully. Cold. It was cold, which surprised me even though I knew it was November, or December maybe. I'd been losing track of the specific calendar date, because 31 days underground, even in a compound that was climate-controlled to 65 degrees, had made me forget what actual outdoor cold felt like. It hit me like stepping into a different room. The air was completely still and smelled like pine resin and something else, faintly, that I didn't want to think about. I came around the rock outcropping and stood on the flat shelf. The ground was clear, no one visible in any direction. I moved to where the north ventilation intake was. a square of anodized aluminum flush with the ground, covered in a layer of dead leaves and debris that made it nearly invisible unless you knew it was there. Someone had been standing on this. They'd left footprints. Or rather, they'd left partial impressions in the soft ground just off the rocky edge of the intake cover. 2 prints, the front half of a boot sole, which means whoever made them was standing with most of their weight back, maybe crouched slightly. The prints were relatively small, not a big person. Next to the prints was something I almost didn't see, a small object placed on the edge of the intake cover. Not dropped, placed. A length of paracord about 6 inches long, with one end knotted into a loop. The kind of thing you might use to mark a location you'd found and intended to come back to. Somebody knew where this vent was, and had marked it for themselves. I took the paracord. I went back inside. I locked the door. Day 33. I spent most of yesterday and this morning deciding what to do about the paracord. The person who left it, I've started calling them the visitor in my head, not because I think they're friendly. I just needed a word, had obviously found the vent intake. The question was how they'd found it. From above, it was nearly invisible. From below, coming up the ridge trail, it was invisible. The only way you found it was if you already had a reason to be searching this specific section of ridge, or if you'd already been on the compound's grounds and found the first entrance, and then come around looking for secondary ventilation exits. The second option meant they knew about the compound. Either they knew from before, or they'd found the main entrance the same way I had, by noticing the keypad, and were now exploring the perimeter. If they'd found the main entrance keypad, they didn't have the access codes. Or they did have the access codes and they weren't using them, because they knew I was in here. Or they'd had the codes at some point and something had changed. I was going in circles, so I made a decision. I would wait 1 more week, maintain routine, stay quiet and dark as much as possible, and observe. If the visitor came back and did something that suggested hostile intent, I'd respond. If they came back and did something that suggested they were a survivor in need of help, I'd respond differently. If they didn't come back at all, I'd have my answer. They came back on day 36, not alone. I saw them on camera 5, 2 people coming up the ridge trail at about 2 p.m., moving carefully, stopping occasionally to listen. They had packs. Their movement suggested they'd done this before, not random civilians stumbling up a mountain, but people who'd been operating in terrain for a while, moving with a specific kind of practiced caution. They reached the flat shelf. They went directly to the north vent intake, the taller of the 2. I still couldn't make out faces at the camera's resolution, just general body shapes, crouched at the intake and seemed to be examining it. They'd noticed the paracord was gone. I watched them through the camera for about 20 minutes. They walked the perimeter of the shelf, the same perimeter I walk, which confirmed they'd been here before and had established a search pattern. They examined the artificial stone panel. They didn't try the keypad. They knew it was there. I could see one of them pointing to it, but they didn't approach it. The taller one sat down on a rock at the edge of the shelf and pulled something from their pack, notebook, started writing. The other one, shorter, wearing a yellow jacket that struck me as less than ideal camouflage, moved away from the taller one and stood at the edge of the shelf, looking down the ridge. Lookout position. They'd done this before too. I sat at the monitor for another hour. At around 3 p.m. they left. They went back down the trail together, the taller one leading. I made a decision that I want to document carefully, because it was not entirely rational, and I knew it wasn't at the time. I went up and left a note. I wrote it on a page from my notebook. Compound occupied, secure. If you need help, knock. Main entrance behind panel. Emergency code 771239. Do not use. Knock only. Will respond if safe. I put the note in a plastic bag, found several in the kitchen, and left it weighted under a rock next to the vent intake. Then I went back inside and lived with that decision for about 18 hours. They knocked on day 38. Not a frantic knock, not an emergency knock. 3 deliberate raps on the panel that I heard through the vent system as a low-impact vibration, which told me they'd come around to the main entrance, opened the outer panel somehow, and knocked on the steel door behind it. I was at the cameras already. I'd been sleeping badly since day 36. Because every time I started drifting off, I'd wonder if today was the day. Today was the day. I watched camera 5 while I listened to the knocking. Camera 5 showed no infected in the visible range of the ridge trail. I didn't have a camera covering the main entrance directly, just the trail below it. I went to the main entrance tunnel. I stood at the inner door, on the compound side, and I said, loudly, through the steel, "How many of you?" A pause. Then, muffled but audible, "Two." A woman's voice. "Just two of us. We're not armed with anything that can get through that door, if that helps. What's in your packs?" Another pause. "Food, water, a medical kit, tools. No weapons bigger than a camp knife. How'd you find this place?" Longer pause this time. Then, "I built part of it." I stood with that for a moment. "Which part?" "The ventilation. I know where all 3 intakes are. The third one is inside that drainage culvert at the south end of the shelf. I designed the layout." I asked one more question, because this was the one that mattered most to me at that point. "Do you know Aldous Pemberton?" "Yes." And then, after a few seconds, "Is he inside with you?" "No," I said. "He didn't make it, I think." Silence on the other side of the door. Then we have a lot to talk about." I opened the door. Donna Farr was 61, short, wore the yellow jacket. She'd worked as an environmental systems engineer for the firm that Pemberton contracted for the compound's HVAC and ventilation design. She'd been on the project for 7 of its 8 years. She knew the facility's physical infrastructure better than I did, and significantly better than Pemberton had. She'd told me within about 15 minutes of coming inside that Pemberton was brilliant with systems and people, but had an engineer's relationship with physical reality that was more theoretical than practical. "He would design something and I would figure out how to build it so it actually worked," she said. We were in the kitchen. I'd made coffee. Found beans in the dry storage. Found a grinder. Found a French press. Because it felt like the right response to an unexpected guest. Also because I hadn't had coffee in 5 weeks, and honestly needed something. Floyd Kessler was 64, tall, quiet. He'd been Donna's partner, romantically, she told me later, for 23 years, and had worked as a general contractor until retirement 3 years earlier. He had a way of looking at the physical structure around him, running his eyes along the ceiling joints and wall seams that reminded me of how I look at terrain. Professional assessment, continuous and involuntary. "How long have you been out there?" I asked. "Since the beginning," Donna said. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug in a way that suggested she'd been cold for a while. "We were in Hendersonville when it started. We walked most of the way here." She said it the way you say things that are terrible, but have to be said plainly to be processed. 41 days. I asked what Hendersonville had been like. She shook her head. "Not no. Exactly. More like, not ready for that yet." Floyd said, looking at the ceiling. "The north duct secondary sensor needs a new calibration module." I noticed the housing was the older model when I was up there. Should be a spare in the mechanical room. I told him I'd had an error code from that sensor on day 5. He nodded, like that was exactly what he'd expected. We talked for 4 hours that first day. I showed them the facility, the whole facility, including the locked door at Corridor 7. When we got to Corridor 7, Donna stopped walking and stood in front of the sealed door for a moment, then turned to me with an expression that said she'd been afraid of this. "Has anyone gone in?" she asked. "No, I found the operations manual section. I read about the sample archive." She nodded slowly. "Pemberton asked me to oversee the construction of the containment specifications for that room. I know what's in there." She was quiet for a moment. "It stays locked." "Agreed," I said. Floyd said nothing. He was looking at the door's airtight seal with his contractor's eye. Then he looked at me and said, "That seal's not original to the construction. Someone added it." "Voss," I said. "She was here about 11 days before I arrived." Donna's expression changed. Something more personal, more specific than the general stress she'd been carrying. "Becca was here? She made it?" "She was here. She left before I arrived. She left a note for Pemberton." I showed them the note I'd found in the back of the journal. Donna read it twice. If she said don't open it, we don't open it, Donna said. She knows more about this than any of us. Where would she have gone? I asked. Donna looked at Floyd. Some communication between them that didn't need words. Then she looked at me and said, there's another location. Pemberton had 2 Phase 2 assets. This is the primary. The secondary is a farmstead in Yancey County, about 60 miles northeast. It's smaller, less supply, but it's there. She paused. Becca knew about it. If she left here in a hurry for a reason, she might have gone there. 60 miles northeast. I thought about what that drive would look like now, and then I made myself stop thinking about it because it wasn't an immediate problem. All right, I said. Let's figure out where you're sleeping. Having Donna and Floyd here changed the compound in ways that are hard to fully describe. Some of it was practical. Floyd immediately started improving things, tightening things, fixing the calibration sensor I'd had the issue with, and 3 others he identified from his knowledge of the original design. Donna took over the communications monitoring and turned out to be significantly better at it than I was, partly because she understood the satellite uplink architecture, and partly because she'd apparently spent years developing a very fine-grained ability to read between the lines of institutional communications. The federal broadcast has been off a specific server for 12 days, she told me on day 42. The automated messages are still running, but they're running from a local relay, not the main EBS center. Whoever was maintaining the main feed isn't anymore. Which means what? Which means I can't tell if there's still a functional federal government or not. Could be they moved operations somewhere. Could be they didn't. I noted this in my log and thought about it more later. But some of the change was harder to quantify. It was the coffee mug in the kitchen that wasn't mine. It was Floyd's work boots by the door to the residential corridor. It was the sound of 2 other people breathing in the hub when I was trying to focus, which was sometimes irritating, and sometimes the most comforting thing I'd experienced in 42 days. It was having someone to tell things to that wasn't a camera. We settled into a routine within about 10 days. I handled the mechanical monitoring and the food rationing. Donna handled communications and the medical room, which she was better qualified to manage than I was. She had basic first aid training and a comfort with clinical environments from years of working in laboratory-adjacent spaces. Floyd handled structural maintenance and any physical work the compound needed, and there was more of it than I'd realized, because Floyd noticed things the rest of us missed. One thing he noticed was on day 47. He'd been looking at the structural specifications for Corridor 7, the documents in the operations manual, and comparing them to what he could see from the outside of the door. He came to find me in the food storage room, where I was doing inventory, and he said, "There's something under the floor in Corridor 7. I put down my clipboard. What kind of something? A sub-level access. It's in the original construction drawings, which I have from when I was subcontracted on the framing phase. There's a below-grade storage vault under Corridor 7's floor. It's not connected to the main facility level. It has its own access point." He paused. "From outside the sealed room." Outside meaning from the corridor, not from inside the room. From the escape tunnel, the south branch of the escape tunnel, the one that goes under the south end of the facility. There's an access hatch in the tunnel floor. I hadn't checked the tunnel floor. I'd checked the hatches going up, but I hadn't looked down. We went to the laundry room access, slid the washing machine aside, went down the ladder, into the escape tunnel. Floyd had a flashlight and walked the south branch slowly, scanning the floor. About 60 feet in, he stopped and crouched. The floor panel was there, flush with the concrete, with a recessed pull handle, almost exactly like the one in the laundry room above. "You want to open it?" he asked. I thought about the note, the one that said, "If you are reading this and you are not A, do not open the sealed section." But this wasn't the sealed room. This was a vault below the sealed room, accessible from outside it. Pemberton's design, or Voss's addition, or both. "Yes," I said. The hatch opened onto another ladder in a smaller space, maybe 10 by 12 feet, lower ceiling. The vault smelled different from the rest of the compound. Less mechanical, more organic, dense paper smell, like a library that had been closed up. There were 2 things in the vault. The first was a large steel cabinet, fireproof, with a combination lock. I didn't know the combination. I made a note of its dimensions and moved on. The second was a wooden crate, unmarked, sitting in the corner, containing 14 plastic cases. Each case was the kind used for storing and transporting sensitive electronic equipment. Foam-lined interior, watertight seal. I opened one. Inside was a hard drive, labeled with a sticker that had a number on it and a date. I opened all 14 cases, 14 hard drives, different dates spanning about 8 years. Backups, obviously. Backups of something. I carried them back up to the communications room and spent the next 6 hours trying to access their contents. They were encrypted, strong encryption, something I wasn't going to crack directly. But on the 12th drive, the oldest one by date, there was an unencrypted file folder on the root level, 2 files in it. A text file with instructions for accessing the encrypted content, an account and key pair, hosted on a private server that was presumably no longer reachable, and a video file. The video was 47 minutes long. I watched it on the communications workstation with Donna and Floyd standing behind me. Pemberton had recorded it himself, sitting in a chair I recognized. One of the hub workstation chairs, though the hub looked different in the video. Earlier stage construction. He was maybe 50 in the video, which placed it about 13 years ago. He looked like someone who'd thought very carefully about what he wanted to say, and was now struggling with whether he'd thought of everything. He said, "If you're watching this, you've found the compound, and you've found the archive vault, which means either everything went as planned, and this is a record of why we built this place, or things didn't go as planned. I'm going to assume the second scenario, because if it's the first scenario, I'll be there to explain things in person." He looked at his hands for a moment. Then, "I want to be clear about why this exists, not the facility, the record. The facility was built because I understood, for a long time before most people allowed themselves to understand it, that the combination of global travel density and the accelerating rate of novel pathogen emergence created a probability envelope for a civilization-scale event that was not acceptable to me. I don't want you to think of this as paranoia. Paranoia is being afraid of things that aren't actually threats. This was a response to a real thing." He paused. "A real thing that I suspect, if you're watching this under the wrong circumstances, is now very much in front of you." He talked for a while about the design philosophy of the compound. Then he talked about something else. "The vault beneath Corridor 7 contains what I want to call the continuity archive, not supplies, information. The hard drives contain the full research output of the independent lab network I've been running for 12 years. I'll be direct about what that research is. It's the complete genomic mapping of 47 pathogen variants, collected from field samples in 16 countries, going back to 2009. It includes 6 variants that the public health community has never characterized, because they emerged in areas where public health systems weren't looking, or were compromised. It includes the full clinical data from a longitudinal study of 42 individuals across 3 countries who showed atypical immune responses to 2 of the high-risk variants. Some of those individuals showed what we're calling partial resistance, not immunity, partial resistance, which is a significant distinction." He looked at the camera directly. "If the cascade event happens as I believe it will, this information is the most important biological research data in existence. Not because it's a cure. It isn't. I want to be honest about that. We don't have a cure. We probably won't develop a cure in any time frame that matters for the immediate crisis. But we have a map. We know what this thing is. We know how it behaves at a molecular level. And we know that some people's biology responds to it differently. If there are researchers left who can use this data, it's the beginning of something. It's not an ending, but it's a beginning." He looked at the camera again, said, "I don't have children. I wasn't close to most people. I spent most of my life preparing for this thing that everyone around me pretended wasn't coming, and that made me lonely in a way I couldn't always explain. But this," he gestured at the facility around him, "this is what I could give. The best I could do was get the information to a safe place and make the safe place available to whoever found it. So, here you are, and here it is." The video ended. The 3 of us sat there for a moment. Floyd put his hand on the back of my chair, not in any particular way, just resting there. Donna had one hand over her mouth. I saved the video file to the compound's main server and closed the drive. Outside, in the dark and the cold, whatever was out there kept being out there. And down here, in the hum and the careful air, this place kept being what it was, a gift from a man who couldn't find a way to live in the world he was trying to save, and so left us the next best thing. Day 53. The calendar is catching up to December now. Donna has set up a proper date-keeping system using the satellite clock, which she tells me is accurate to within fractions of a second, and will stay accurate as long as the satellite remains operational, which she cannot guarantee, but estimates as a good while yet. I've started going outside twice a week. Short trips, always in daylight, always on the ridge, always back within 2 hours. I wear dark clothing, found a comprehensive supply in a storage locker I missed in week 1, and I stay low when I'm not under cover of the trees. The infected I've observed from the ridge. They're moving down into the valleys. The pattern is consistent. They follow roads and sound, and the natural drainage of terrain. They don't know what a ridge is. They don't have a concept of high ground as tactically useful. They walk until something pulls them toward it, and then they walk toward it. Without a consistent noise source, they drift. They cluster around areas where there's residual sound, generators, animals, structural movement from wind stress on damaged buildings. The mountain, so far, is quiet enough that we don't see many up here. 1 or 2 a week on the lower trail, moving through rather than stopping. As long as we're quiet, they pass. Donna has established radio contact with another survivor group. I want to document this carefully because it's the most significant thing that's happened this week. She was running a systematic shortwave scan. She does it every morning between 9 and 11 a.m. when she picked up a signal on 7.25 MHz. A voice, not automated. A man's voice, calling in a specific rhythm. 3-second transmission, 7-second pause, repeat. The rhythm of someone who has been trained in radio procedure. She responded. The man's name, or at least the name he gave, was Walt. Just Walt. He wouldn't give a location initially, which was the right response. Neither did Donna, initially. They established a back and forth that took about 40 minutes of careful information exchange, each side releasing information in small increments, and watching what came back before releasing more. Walt said he was part of a group of 11 people. He said they were in a fixed location that he described as north of the national forest boundary, which could mean many things in this terrain. He said they had medical training among their group. He said they were secure but running low on fuel, and had identified 3 other shortwave contacts in the region in the previous month, 2 of which had since gone silent. He said he was looking for medical supplies specifically, antibiotics. He mentioned a leg wound in the group that was showing signs of early infection. Donna relayed this to me. I thought about it. Then I asked her to ask him one question. Had he heard anything about a compound in the Pisgah area? His response, after a pause that was a few seconds longer than the conversational rhythm had been, I've heard something. Why do you ask? Day 55. Walt's group and ours had our 3rd radio exchange. He'd given us a cleaner location now. They were in a building complex near Burnsville. He was using the word complex carefully, which suggested it was a significant structure. His group's medical person, he referred to her as our doc, not by name, had managed to stabilize the leg wound with the supplies they had, but Walt said it was still a concern. They were holding but not comfortable. He told us 2 things that mattered. 1. There was a 3rd group in the region, which he'd made contact with recently, and this group was larger. 14 or 15 people, he thought, though the count was uncertain. They were moving, not fixed, mobile, traveling by vehicle. He said they'd been traveling for about 3 weeks, working their way generally west, and that they were organized in a particular way, which was a phrase he used twice, and which Donna and I both noticed and discussed after the exchange. 2. The mobile group was asking about supplies. Specifically, they were asking if anyone in the area knew of a location with fuel and food. They were asking around. Donna looked at me when she relayed this second point. I looked at the camera. This camera, the one I've been recording to, and thought for a moment. Asking around. 14 or 15 people, organized in a particular way, asking around about supply locations. I told Donna to keep the exchange going with Walt. I told her not to confirm or deny anything about the compound. She understood without me elaborating. Then I went to the food store and spent 2 hours double-checking the inventory. Day 60. The 4th week of December now. I want to note that I've been maintaining the heating system carefully because the compound's ventilation runs on an air exchange cycle that pulls outside air, conditions it, and circulates it. The outside air temperature has been dropping, currently sitting around 28 degrees Fahrenheit at night, according to the external temperature sensor in the north vent intake, which Floyd repaired on day 47. During the day it gets to maybe 37, 38. The infected, Donna has noted from the camera feeds, seem to slow down in the cold. This matches what I've observed on the surface. The ones I see on the lower trail move more slowly than they did in early November. Not frozen, not incapacitated, but slower, less responsive to distant sound. Donna thinks it might be something to do with whatever is running their motor functions, some biological process that's temperature sensitive. I don't know. I noted it, and we've all started to think of cold weather as a relative advantage. Day 60. Also, someone new on the surface cameras. Camera 6, the Forest Service road, picked up a vehicle, moving slowly, which made sense given the road's condition, but moving. A dark-colored SUV, older model, roof loaded with gear. It passed the camera's view from east to west at about 1 p.m. and didn't stop, didn't turn up the estate access road. Just passed. I watched the camera for another 2 hours. The vehicle didn't come back in either direction. I noted the plate number as best I could read it from the camera's resolution. Partial. The first 3 characters looked like 7K something. North Carolina plate. Donna ran a search through the satellite data connection. She'd found a way to access certain legacy databases that were still running on automated servers. An impressive piece of work she executed with quiet efficiency. But the partial plate wasn't enough to return a useful result. Moving vehicle. Occupied vehicle. Someone else alive. Moving through this territory. Day 63. Lena showed up without warning. Which is how these things go, I'm learning. You plan carefully. You observe. You maintain caution. And then someone arrives in a way you didn't anticipate and forces you to respond in real time without the luxury of careful planning. She was at the surface entrance, the main one, behind the rock panel, when I went up for my 10 a.m. external check. I came out of the panel and nearly walked into her because she was sitting on the ground directly in front of the entrance, back against the rock, with her knees up and her head resting on her knees. She was either unconscious or extremely asleep. I stopped and stayed very still for about 5 seconds. Then I said, at a low volume, "Hey!" She came awake immediately. Not the slow emergence of someone who'd been deeply sleeping. The instant, full alert response of someone who'd trained themselves to be reachable from sleep. She scrambled backward about 2 feet before she saw I was just a person, a non-infected person, standing there in front of her with nothing in my hands. She was young, 26, 27, somewhere in there, though she had the kind of tired behind her eyes that adds years. Dark hair, medium build, wearing a jacket that had been excellent waterproofing at some point and was now adequate. A pack at her feet that had seen serious use. The straps were frayed and the bottom was stained. She had a hatchet on her right hip, handle worn smooth from use. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she said, "The note, you left the note." I said yes. She said, "I've been watching you, going in and out. I wanted to make sure you were..." She paused. "I wanted to make sure you were okay first." I thought about what that meant, that she'd been watching me go in and out for how long? How long had she been on this mountain? "How long have you been here?" I asked. She looked at the ground for a moment, then at me. "About 3 weeks," she said. "I found your note on day 2. I wasn't sure." 3 weeks. She'd been out here on the mountain for 3 weeks, watching, deciding, in December, in 28-degree nights. "Come inside," I said. "It's cold." "I know it's cold," she said, and almost smiled. Almost. Lena Marsh, no relation to me as it happens. though both of us found that worth a brief, dark laugh when we established it. She'd been a graduate student, environmental science, 2 years into her PhD, focusing on watershed management in the southern Appalachians. She'd been doing field work in the forest when the outbreak started, and had been, in an awful irony, already in the remotest part of her research area when the roads became impassable. She'd been in a tent when it started, alone. She'd been alone for nearly 2 months. She didn't talk about most of it, not yet, and I didn't push. She ate 2 cans of soup in about 10 minutes, and then she ate a bowl of oatmeal, and then she drank 2 glasses of water without stopping. Donna sat across from her at the kitchen table and didn't say anything for a while, just let her eat. Floyd brought her a towel and pointed her toward the bathroom, which had a functional shower from the compound's water system. When she came out of the shower, she looked different. Not better exactly, still with that tired behind her eyes, but more herself, whatever that meant for someone I'd just met. She sat back down at the kitchen table and looked at the 3 of us and said, "I heard your radio." I looked at Donna. "When?" Donna asked. "About 2 weeks ago, early morning. I was at the edge of the ridge above the compound, and the signal was coming up through the vent." She paused. "You were talking to someone named Walt." The vent. The north vent intake. She'd been sitting on that vent intake, the same one I'd heard footsteps from on day 31, the one where I found the paracord marker. She'd been there, regularly, listening to our radio communications through the ventilation system. I sat back in my chair. "What did you hear?" "Enough," she said. "I know about the mobile group, the organized one." She said the word organized the same way Walt had, with emphasis, implying something beyond its face meaning. "I've seen them." "Seen them when?" "About 10 days ago on the Forest Service road below." She glanced at Floyd. "They passed in a dark SUV. I looked at Donna again. Day 60's camera. The vehicle. We'd been watching for it from the compound. Lena had been watching for it from above." "How many?" I asked. "The SUV had 4 people in it, but they stopped about a mile down the road and I saw them talking to a group that was already there on foot. Total, maybe," she thought for a moment, 8, maybe 9 that I could count. They had radios, different kinds. They were coordinating something. 8 or 9. Walt had said 14 or 15 total, so Walt's count might have included people Lena hadn't seen, or Walt's count was wrong, or there was more than one group, and Walt had conflated them. "Were they okay?" Donna asked. "I mean, did they seem—" "They seemed fine. They were moving organized, like a team. Nobody panicking." Lena wrapped her hands around her soup mug. "But they were asking a local. There was a man, older, not part of their group, looked like he'd been in the area, and they were asking him things. I couldn't hear what from where I was, but he was pointing. In this direction. This direction. Day 67. We had a team meeting, all 4 of us in the hub, using the workstation chairs in a loose circle, which felt both very serious and slightly absurd simultaneously. I'd never run a team meeting underground in an apocalypse before. I don't think any of us had. The things we needed to decide: what to do about the mobile group, what to do about Walt, what to do about Lena's information about the man who'd been pointing in this direction. The things we agreed on relatively quickly, we weren't broadcasting. Donna would continue radio contact with Walt, because Walt seemed to be in good faith, and because a group of 11 people with medical training was potentially an asset if things developed badly for any of us. But we were not, under any circumstances, telling Walt our specific location or the specific nature of what we had here. The thing we disagreed on, whether to tell Walt about the mobile group. If he doesn't know they're in the area and they make contact with him, he might tell them what he knows, Lena said. She'd been here 3 days and was already contributing to the analysis in a way that felt natural and necessary. He doesn't know to be careful about it. But if we warn him, we're implying we have specific information about a group, which raises the question of where our information comes from, Donna said. Which leads back to Lena being out on the surface. Which leads back to why she's on this ridge instead of down in the valley. That's solvable, I said. We can tell him we've had visual contact with a mobile group in our general area. That's true. and it's something he'd want to know, and it doesn't reveal specifics. Floyd had been quiet through most of this. He said, "The real question is whether the mobile group is a threat or a resource." "Both," Lena said immediately. "Both," I agreed. "The question is which one first?" Floyd nodded. "You deal with both things differently if you're planning ahead." We didn't resolve that question on day 67, but I gave Donna the go-ahead to include a general mention of the mobile group in the next Walt exchange. She did so on day 68. Walt's response was interesting. He'd already heard of them. He called them the convoy, which suggested they'd introduced themselves to multiple groups, and were doing so deliberately. He said one of the 2 radio contacts that had gone silent 4 days after the convoy made contact with them. He said this neutrally, but the timing was in the sentence. Week 10, I want to catch up on some things I've been documenting in the notebook, but not in this camera record. The food situation, still good. We're 4 people now instead of 1, which changes the math significantly. 4 people at roughly 2,000 calories per day is 8,000 calories a day, which, against the original stock, is roughly a 2-year supply instead of 3. Still excellent. More than excellent. But the margin has changed, and I'm tracking it more closely now. Donna has been helping with rationing. She has a more systematic mind for this than I do, which I've accepted without ego, because I'd rather eat well for 2 years than feel prideful about my calorie counting system for 3 months. Water. The storage tank refills from a gravity-fed system connected to the same aquifer that feeds the creek below the ridge. As long as the aquifer holds, and there's no reason to think it won't in any near-term time frame, we have water. I flush the filtration system weekly. Fuel. This is the one I worry about. The diesel supply is our most finite and most critical resource. I've reduced generator operation to the minimum required, 1 generator, running on a reduced duty cycle, with the climate control set a few degrees lower than Pemberton's original spec, and all non-essential lighting either off or on manual control. By my calculations, this extends our fuel supply to somewhere between 18 and 24 months, depending on how cold the winters get and whether we need to run supplementary heating. It's enough. But it's not the 8-year theoretical maximum I'd initially felt comfortable about. Medical. Donna has inventoried the medical room twice. She's established basic protocols for what she calls likely events, cuts and wound management, gastrointestinal issues from diet changes, respiratory illness management given that we can't risk outside medical care. She's read 3 chapters of the surgical manual and says she'd attempt a simple procedure if she absolutely had to. I believe her. The corridor 7 door, still locked, still sealed, still making a very specific sound when I knock on the wall next to it. The sound of a room with something in it that isn't moving. I check it weekly. Nothing has changed. Day 71. The convoy made contact. Not with us. With Walt. He reported it in the morning exchange. He'd received them on radio. They'd asked to meet. He'd agreed to a meeting at a neutral location. He'd described the meeting afterward. He said, "Their leader is a man named Russell, mid-40s. Military background, decisive. They have fuel, more than Walt's group, and they have a vehicle that runs and access to 3 vehicles total. They're looking for a fixed base. They have food for about 6 weeks and need either more food or a location where they can source it." Walt had been honest with them. He'd told them about the radio contacts in the area. He'd told them there might be a compound somewhere in the National Forest boundary zone. I heard this from Donna with a kind of deliberate calm that I was performing, because the alternative wasn't helpful. Walt hadn't told them specifics, because Walt didn't have specifics. But he'd told them there might be a compound, and Russell's group was already in the region, already moving, already looking. I asked Donna, how did Russell describe his background? Military, what branch, what role? She asked Walt in the next exchange. Walt's answer, Russell had described himself as former logistics, Army, served 2 tours in the Middle East, 8 years total service. Former logistics, Army, experienced with supply chain management and resource organization, the kind of person who knew exactly how to assess and control a supply point. I thought about that for a day. Then I made a decision that I want to explain properly, because it was a real decision, not a reactive one, and I want the record to show it was thought through. Day 73. I called Russell on the radio myself. I didn't tell the others I was doing it first. I planned to, but I wanted to make the initial contact alone, because I needed to hear the man for myself, without running the conversation through Donna's much more generous interpretation of people's intentions. Donna is an optimist in the specific way that comes from decades of making things work with teams of people, and she defaults to assuming good faith. That's an asset in most contexts. I needed to make this call without that particular bias in the room. I found his frequency from the information Walt had passed. I called on that frequency at 2 p.m. on day 73. He answered on the second transmission. His voice was measured and direct. I have to give him that. There was no wasted performance in it, no posturing. He said, "Who am I talking to?" "Garrett," I said. "You?" "Russell. Are you the compound contact?" "I'm a contact." "Yes. I'm not going to give you a location, Russell." "I wouldn't expect you to," he said. "Not yet." The "not yet" was precisely placed. We talked for 45 minutes. He was good at this, at seeming reasonable, at giving information in a measured way that felt like reciprocal exchange, even though I was aware he was managing the exchange. He told me about his group, 9 people, including himself, 4 with military or law enforcement background, 2 with medical training, one of whom he described as qualified. They'd come from Raleigh, moving generally west for the past 4 weeks. They had fuel, they had transport, they had discipline. "What are you looking for?" I asked. "A place to stop," he said. "Somewhere defensible with a supply base. We've been mobile long enough to know that mobile is short-term, long-term is fixed. And if you can't find a place to stop," a pause. "Then we evaluate our options," he said, which wasn't an answer. It was the shape of an answer, which was a different thing. "What happened to the 2 radio contacts in the area that went quiet?" I asked. Another pause. Longer. "One of them went quiet because they had a health emergency, and we couldn't help in time. The other one," he stopped. Started again. "The other one made a poor decision about who they were talking to. We tried to advise them against it. They didn't take the advice." "What decision?" "They broadcast their location on an open frequency, by name, with grid coordinates. We heard it. About 30 other people heard it." He let that settle. "Their decision, not ours." I processed that. It was plausible. It was also unfalsifiable, which was interesting. "I need to think," I said. "I'll contact you again in 48 hours. "I'll be here," he said. And then, "Garrett, I'm going to be direct with you. We're not going to threaten this situation. I've worked in logistics for a long time, and I understand exactly what happens to a supply base when it's threatened. It burns, or it gets denied, and nobody gains anything. I'm not interested in burning things. I'm interested in supply lines." 48 hours, I said, and signed off. The next 48 hours were some of the more difficult I've spent here. And I've spent some difficult hours here. I told the others about the call the same evening. Donna's reaction was, as expected, more open than mine. Lena's reaction was the closest to mine. She'd seen Russell's group from the surface, and had been quietly uneasy about the convoy framing ever since. Floyd listened to everything, and then said, "9 people is a lot of mouths for someone else's supply." "Fewer than 9 for us," I said. "If they're already moving toward this area anyway, having them on the outside without knowing we're here might be worse than knowing what we're dealing with." "Or we could move," Lena said. "Not permanently, but leave a period of time. Let them move through. Come back." We spent an hour on the move option. The problem with the move option was several problems. The compound's supply stock wasn't portable in any meaningful sense. The fuel was underground in a fixed tank. The medical equipment wasn't field transportable. Moving meant abandoning 3 years of supplies to people who would either use them, which would mean eventually running out, or damage them in the process of accessing things they didn't fully understand. Also, where would we go? Yancey County, Donna said quietly. The secondary location. I'd been thinking about it too. It's 60 miles, I said. I don't know road conditions. We'd need to scout it first, Lena said, before committing to it as a fallback. I have something to add, Floyd said. We all looked at him. He'd been quiet again, the way he gets when he's been thinking. The escape tunnels exit on two sides of the ridge. One of those exit hatches, the south one, comes up about 40 yards south of the estate's boundary fence. That's Forest Service land immediately outside the fence. If you needed to move quietly, in the dark, without being seen from the trail or the access road, that's how you'd do it. I added this to the mental map. The south escape hatch, Forest Service land, 40 yards from the fence. On day 75, I called Russell back. I told him we'd meet. Not at the compound. At a neutral location I'd specify. Outside. Somewhere I could see clearly and retreat from quickly if needed. He agreed to that without argument, which I noted as either genuine good faith or very good tactical patience. We set it for day 78. I told him 4 people, no more, for his side. I'd be bringing 2 from mine. He said fine. I spent days 76 and 77 preparing for this in ways that felt excessive and necessary at the same time. I showed Lena and Floyd the south escape tunnel exit and walked them through the emergency protocol. If I wasn't back within 4 hours of my departure, seal the south hatch from below. Do not open the main entrance. Maintain radio silence on the Walt frequency. If Walt's exchange in the next morning window didn't happen, try the frequency one more time and then go dark. Donna stayed in the compound during the meet, non-negotiable from her point of view, and honestly from mine too. She was our most critical person right now, between the communications work and the medical competence. Lena came with me. I wanted someone who'd actually seen this group in person. We went out the south escape hatch at 7 a.m. on day 78, into weak December sunlight and 31-degree air, crossed the boundary fence, and moved southeast through the forest. The meeting point was an abandoned ranger station about a mile from the estate boundary, a location I knew from my surveying work, a place I knew had only one road access and 2 ground-level exit points, which I confirmed by hiking out the day before. Russell's group arrived 8 minutes after we did. 4 of them, as agreed, Russell and 3 others. Russell was maybe 45, medium height, economical movements, the kind of person who assesses a room when he enters it. He was doing it to the ranger station clearing as he came through the trees, reading exits, reading positions, reading us. He saw Lena first, then me, and he registered the hatchet on Lena's hip and the folding knife visible on my belt with a brief glance that was professional rather than aggressive. The 3 with him, a woman, 30s, close-cropped hair, carrying a proper first aid bag, a man about my age, very quiet, stayed near the tree line, and a younger man, maybe 20, who looked like he was doing his best to appear more certain about this than he felt. We stood about 15 feet apart. Russell said, "Garrett." I said, "Russell." He let the silence sit for a beat. Then, "I appreciate this. I know it wasn't easy to agree to. Tell me about the radio contact that went quiet," I said. "The second one, the one who broadcast their location." He looked at me steadily. They were at a school, 40 miles east, 11 people. They broadcast their location in the clear because they were scared and hoped someone would come to them. Someone did. He paused. Not us. A different group. We never even made it there in time. He kept his eyes on me. We saw the school 3 days later. We kept moving. I couldn't read if that was the truth. The woman with the first aid bag was watching me. She had the specific expression of someone who knew the question I was asking behind the question I'd asked. "Tell me what you're proposing," I said. Russell's proposal was, actually, more reasonable than I'd prepared myself for. He wasn't asking for the compound. He was asking for an arrangement. His group would take the secondary position, the road approach, the estate access, and function as a forward screen, dealing with threats before they reached the inner perimeter. In exchange, they'd need access to the compound's food supply on a scheduled, documented basis that we controlled. They had fuel they were willing to pool. They had people with field medicine experience. They had vehicles and range, meaning they could run supply expeditions that we, with our 4 people, couldn't do at the same scale. He said, "You have something I can't build. I have capabilities you can't field." That's an exchange that doesn't require either side to give up control of what they have. I asked, "What happens if we disagree about something? About what to do, where to go, who to bring in?" "Same thing that happens in any organization," he said. "We talk, we negotiate. If we can't reach agreement, we act independently and deal with the consequences of that." Lena, beside me, said, "How many people in your group have been in the compound or know about it at this point?" Russell looked at her for the first time directly. 4, including me. The others know we're looking for a fixed base. They don't know specifics. "It needs to stay that way," Lena said. "Not a question." Russell held her gaze. "Agreed. For now." "For now." I told him I'd need to discuss it with my people and would contact him in the next 2 days. He nodded. We went our separate ways. Walking back through the forest with Lena, neither of us said anything for a while. Then she said, "His number 2, the woman with the medical kit. What about her?" "She knew something," Lena said. "When you asked about the school, she knew what you were really asking. She looked at you like she had an answer and was deciding whether to give it." I'd noticed that too. I hadn't mentioned it because I wasn't sure how to use it. "We'd need to talk to her separately," I said. "Yeah," Lena said, "we would." Day 80, the decision. We voted, all 4 of us, which felt odd but felt right. The result was 3-1 in favor of the arrangement. Donna and Floyd both yes. Lena reluctantly yes. Me with reservations that I'd decided to vote through rather than against. I called Russell and told him. He said he'd move his people into position in the next 48 hours. He asked for coordinates, which I didn't give him. I gave him a landmark, a large boulder on the lower access road that anyone who'd been in the area for more than a day would know. He said that was fine. On day 82, Russell's group established themselves at the main house on the estate grounds. Not inside. The house was cold and hadn't been heated, but in the outbuildings. The equipment barn and the old groundskeeper's cottage, which had a functioning wood stove. They moved in with what they had. Floyd took them through the estate's physical infrastructure, what worked, what didn't, where the water was, because Floyd had been running that assessment in his head since he arrived, and because sharing that information cost us nothing and built something. The woman with the first aid bag was named Patricia. I introduced myself properly when I met her at the groundskeeper's cottage. She was a nurse, she said. Emergency department, 8 years, Raleigh. She'd been with Russell's group since the 3rd week. I asked, when it was just the 2 of us in the cottage doorway, about the school. She said, "Russell's version is accurate. We did find it 3 days after. We didn't do anything there." She stopped, started again. "But we'd been there 2 weeks before, when those people were still there and still alive. And Russell told them not to broadcast. He told them it was dangerous. They didn't listen." She looked at her hands. "I've been trying to decide if we could have done more. I don't think so, but I've been trying to decide." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. She looked at me directly. "Because you were going to find out eventually, or you were going to spend too much energy worrying about something you couldn't verify. This is what happened. You can do whatever you want with it." I thought about that for a while. Patricia became, over the next several weeks, one of the more reliable people in this expanded arrangement. December deepened. The cold got more serious. Donna tracked a low of 17 Fahrenheit on a Sunday night, which was cold enough that the infected on the lower roads weren't moving much at all by midday. Russell's group reported seeing 3 on the Forest Service road during their first week, all moving extremely slowly, none of them reacting to Russell's team even at close range. They let them pass and moved back inside. The radio contact with Walt continued. Donna had told him about the arrangement with Russell's group, vaguely, without specifics, and Walt's response had been cautious, but accepting. He had enough on his hands, managing his own group. The leg wound he'd mentioned in the early exchanges was healing, Patricia confirmed when she joined the radio session, correcting his description of the treatment protocol from across a radio connection in a way that made me like her considerably. I'd been thinking about the secondary location in Yancey County for 2 weeks. Pemberton's journals had described it as a farmstead, and the operations binder had a single page referencing it. A property he called Site 2, latitude-longitude coordinates I had mapped, with a note that read, minimum viable, 6-month single occupancy, food, water source, generation capacity, not fitted for extended occupation. 6 months minimum. That was enough. What I needed was to know what state it was in, whether it was occupied, and whether the route between here and there was passable. I want to go there, I said to Donna on day 91, scout run, 2 or 3 days. She looked at me for a long time, not because she disagreed, I think, because of what going there might mean. 60 miles, 3 weeks of outbreak time. We both had our own internal calculations running about what 60 miles looked like right now. Take Russell's vehicle, she said finally. Take Lena. Take food for 5 days in case you need it. And take the radio. Day 93. We left at 5:30 a.m. in Russell's best vehicle, a diesel Land Cruiser from 1997 that was mechanically sound and had the additional benefit of not having any of the modern electronics that newer vehicles had, which Floyd said made it more reliable under conditions of power infrastructure variability. I'd spent an hour the night before with Floyd, going over the mechanical basics, because I'm not a mechanic, but I know how to do basic field repair, and knowing what to look for helped. Russell's fuel reserve went into the tank. We topped it up to full from the compound's diesel supply, the first time I'd drawn from that reserve, which I logged carefully. Lena navigated. We had paper maps from the compound's library. The estate had a comprehensive collection of USC's topo maps for western North Carolina, Pemberton being the kind of person who kept physical copies of everything, and Lena spread them on the dashboard and called out route adjustments as we moved. She had an easy relationship with terrain reading. 2 months in the mountains will do that. The first 20 miles were on secondary roads, moving northeast. We saw signs of the outbreak on both sides. Vehicles stopped at odd angles, some with doors open. A pharmacy in a small crossroads town, where the windows had been broken and the interior looted to the shelves. A gas station with a pump left running, until it ran dry, judging by the smell still in the air. We didn't stop for any of these. We stopped twice on the first day. Once to move a vehicle that was blocking the road. A pickup that had rolled off the shoulder and was sitting at a 45-degree angle, with its wheels in the ditch and its body blocking enough of the lane that we couldn't get around. Floyd had given me a tow strap. I hooked it to the pickup's hitch and dragged it far enough that we had room to pass. The pickup was empty, which was a relief. Lena kept watch with the hatchet on her hip and her eyes moving while I worked the strap, and we both kept quiet, which took focus, because physical work usually makes you want to breathe loud and grunt, and I was forcing myself not to. Second stop, a hardware store in a town I won't name because giving location data in this recording feels wrong. The parking lot had 3 infected in the far corner, moving very slowly, reacting to something I couldn't identify. Maybe the building's structural settling in the cold. We watched them for 5 minutes to establish their movement pattern, decided they were far enough from the store entrance to not be a factor, and went in. 30 minutes. Diesel fuel cans. Found 6, 2 of them still full. A box of assorted screws and hardware. A handsaw. Duct tape. And, this was Lena's find, a full propane tank attached to a portable heater, which she loaded in the back of the Land Cruiser with the focus of someone who'd spent the last 2 months very cold. We cleared out while 2 of the 3 infected in the parking lot were still turned away from us. The third one had turned toward the building entrance. We were in the vehicle and moving before it had taken 3 steps in our direction. Day 94. We reached the Yancey County coordinates in the late morning. The farmstead was real. The access road was a single-track dirt path off a rural route, about 3/4 of a mile long, opening onto a flat field with a farmhouse and 3 outbuildings. The farmhouse was a 2-story structure, solid-looking, 19th century construction with 20th century additions. The windows were intact. The doors were closed. I drove up the access road slowly, with both windows cracked to listen. Nothing unusual. The field was quiet. The sky was that specific winter gray that means nothing specific, but feels like it means something. I stopped the vehicle about 50 yards from the house, and we sat for 10 minutes, watching. Nothing moved on or near the building. No sounds from inside that carried to us over the noise of the engine, which I then turned off, which gave us silence. Still nothing. We approached on foot, one on each side, the way we'd worked out between us as a default approach for buildings. Lena went to the left of the front door. I went to the right. I knocked on the door frame, not the door itself. 2 knocks, pause, 2 more. Waiting 3 minutes. Nothing answered. The door was unlocked. We went in. The house was cold. Not as cold as outside. The insulation in the walls was doing some work even without heat. But cold. It had been occupied at some point in recent months. There were food wrappers in the kitchen, a sleeping bag on the couch in the living room, a collection of candles on the kitchen table with burned-down wax pooled beneath them. Whoever had been here had left deliberately, rather than in a panic. The sleeping bag was folded. The candles were placed carefully. The kitchen was relatively neat. On the kitchen table, under one of the candle holders, was a folded piece of paper. I recognized the handwriting before I even fully unfolded it. It said, Phase 2 secured. I can't stay. The south road is compromised. You'll know when you see it. I've left supplies in the root cellar. The cellar access is under the hay in the left barn. Samples are safe. I'm going northeast. I have a contact in Avery County who knows more than any of us. Trust the data, not the models. The models were wrong. No signature. She didn't need to sign it. Voss. She'd been here. She'd set up Pemberton's secondary site. She'd confirmed its operability. She'd left supplies and a note that assumed someone would follow. And then she'd moved on. Northeast, Avery County. She keeps moving, Lena said. She has a reason, I said. We found the root cellar in the left barn. Hay on the floor, and under the hay, a flush hatch. Inside the cellar, 2 weeks of food for maybe 4 people. Canned goods, dry staples, a small propane supply. Not what the compound had, nothing like it, but enough for a forward outpost, enough for a rest point on a route. We spent the night in the farmhouse. I set up a watch rotation with Lena. 2 hours on, 2 hours off, cycling through the night. Neither of us slept well even on our off shifts, but we slept some. In the morning, I wrote my own note and left it on the table under the same candle holder. This is the compound contact. We are here and operational. 60 miles southwest. If you find us first, use 7.250 megahertz or come to the Pisgah Estate Access Road, South Gate. We want to hear from you. I left the compound's channel on a scrap of paper next to it. Then we drove home. Day 98. Back in the compound, I've spent the last 2 days writing up the Yancey County expedition as a proper report for the record. Locations, conditions, what we found, what we left. The farmstead is serviceable as a way station. It's not a refuge, not long-term, but it's a point on a map that we control, or at least that we know about. The note from Voss is something I've been thinking about carefully. Trust the data, not the models. The models were wrong. This had a specific meaning, coming from her. The models Pemberton had built, the scenarios he'd prepared against, were not what was happening. The cascade event he'd feared was real, but it was working differently than predicted. What differently meant, precisely, was in those encrypted hard drives in the vault, and on those hard drives, we didn't have the key to open. I have a half-formed idea about the hard drives. Pemberton had mentioned an account and key pair on the oldest drive, a private server. The server was presumably down, the internet infrastructure being what it was, but the key pair might be on the hard drives themselves, if I could find the right one. The oldest drive had been unencrypted. If Pemberton had archived the encryption keys locally, as a backup to the server copy, they might be on one of the other unencrypted or partially unencrypted files I hadn't fully explored. I started this work on day 99, and it took me until day 108 to find it, which goes to show how much I am not a data forensics expert. But I found it, a text file on drive 7, sitting in a folder labeled admin, with a naming convention so plain it was almost invisible. The file was called keyfile.txt, and it was exactly what it sounded like. I called Floyd and Donna into the communications room, because at this point, nothing like this happened without everyone knowing. I loaded the drive. I navigated to the encrypted contents. I entered the key. The drive opened. Day 108. What we found on the drives took the next several days to begin to understand. I'm not going to pretend I have the medical or scientific background to evaluate all of it. I don't, and neither does anyone else in the compound, except possibly Patricia, who spent the first evening reading files with the focused expression of someone encountering a foreign language they half spoke. She kept making sounds, not words, just sounds that meant yes, okay, right, and then a few that meant, I didn't know that. The short version of what the drives contained: 12 years of research, like Pemberton had described in the video, 47 pathogen variants mapped, 6 never characterized by public health, clinical data on 42 individuals with atypical immune responses. But there was something else on the drives that Pemberton hadn't described in the video, a separate research branch, initiated by Voss about 3 years before the outbreak, labeled Neurological Cascade, Mechanism, not the symptoms of neurological cascade, the mechanism, the actual molecular process by which the pathogen produced what it produced in infected individuals. I read this section slowly, several times, in the way you read things you don't fully understand, but know are important. What I understood of it was this: whatever the pathogen was doing to nervous system function, it wasn't destroying it, it was redirecting it. The motor functions in infected individuals were operational. That was observable. The sensory functions appeared operational in a degraded way. But the higher cortical processes, reasoning, language, self-regulation, anything we'd associate with being a person in the full sense, those weren't being destroyed by the pathogen either. They were being suppressed, put into what Voss's notes called an inhibited state. Not dead, suppressed. She'd written, in a note at the bottom of one of the analysis files, if the inhibition is reversible, and there are theoretical mechanisms by which it could be, then what we are dealing with is not the dead, but the locked. This changes the ethical calculus of every decision we have made, and will make. I need more data. I need the Avery County contact. His findings from the 2020 cohort are the only existing precedent. I sat with that for a long time. Not the dead, the locked. Day 112. I want to document this properly, because I don't want to misremember the order of events. I told the others what I'd read. All of us, including Russell, who was now a regular enough presence, that excluding him from significant information felt like a problem I'd have to deal with on the back end. His reaction to the locked, not dead finding was the most practical of all of us. He said, if that's true, then we have to be even more careful about eliminating them, because we'd be eliminating something we might be able to help. Patricia said, we don't have a mechanism for helping, not yet, so we operate as we have been, carefully, and we add this to the information we're carrying. Lena was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Drew, her brother, she'd said once, briefly, dead, or locked. She said the word locked with something very specific in her face, and I didn't say anything because there wasn't anything I could usefully say. Donna said, we need to find Voss. We need to find the Avery County contact. Day 113. I called Walt and told him, stripped of specifics about the compound, what we'd found on the drives. I felt he deserved to know. It was information, and information should move. Walt was quiet for a long time on the radio. Then he said, how long has someone known this? Voss started the analysis 3 years ago, I said. Another long silence. Is she reachable? We're trying, I said. He said, my medical person. Her background is in research neurology. I don't know if she can make anything of what you've described, but she should try. This was new information. His doc was a neurologist. I asked for her frequency access. He gave it. Day 115. I want to tell you something about what 115 days underground feels like, because I've been recording operational and event-based things and not the texture of the time, and the texture of the time matters. It feels like living inside a very long afternoon. The light doesn't change. The hub's indirect lighting cycles on a timer I've set to approximate daylight, bright from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m., dimmed after that, but it's still artificial. It's still the same light, and your body knows the difference even if you don't consciously register it. I sleep more than I used to, and worse. I dream about outside things, not nightmares, just normal dreams about surface life, which are almost worse because I wake up and the ceiling is concrete. The four of us in the compound have developed the kind of familiarity that comes from being in close quarters with people who can't leave. It's not friendship exactly, or it's friendship mixed with something else. Mutual dependency that is so total you stop thinking about it as dependency and start thinking about it as just how things are. Donna knows I dislike the oatmeal in the morning, but make it anyway, because the caloric profile is good. Floyd knows I'll stay up too late reading and will be short-tempered the next morning if he tries to talk to me before coffee. Lena knows I'll listen without interrupting if she needs to talk, which she sometimes does and sometimes doesn't. I know things about them that I won't record because those are theirs. Russell's group, in the outbuildings, are more separate, which is by design, mine and theirs both. There are 9 of them now, actually 10. They picked up one more survivor, a man named Dale who'd been alone in the valley for 6 weeks, in rough shape physically and mentally. Patricia managed his initial health assessment and told me privately that the rough shape was getting better. He worked with his hands. Floyd put him on compound maintenance projects within 3 days. Patricia comes inside the compound 2 or 3 days a week, working with Donna on the medical room protocols. She and Lena have developed a specific kind of friendship that I would describe as they respect each other's capability and have agreed not to like each other too openly, which means they probably like each other quite a bit. The infected outside, fewer visible as winter has settled in. The cold is doing something. We're theorizing, cautiously. Maybe slowing the cellular processes that drive whatever locomotion they're operating on. Maybe not. We observe, we note. Day 117. Voss called. Not in the conventional sense. She'd found our frequency, either because of the note in the farmhouse, or because she'd always known it, because Pemberton's communications infrastructure was something she'd helped design, and she knew where the channels were. She called at 3:47 a.m. on a morning when I was awake, because I'd heard something in the vent that turned out to be a bird landing on the intake cover. I was in the communications room when the signal came in. Her voice was different from what I'd expected, though I'd never met her, so I had no basis for expectation. It was steady and direct, and carried the kind of authority that comes not from assertiveness, but from being correct about things a long time. She said, "Is this the compound?" I said yes. She said, "I'm in Avery County. I'm with the contact. I need you to tell me that Corridor 7 is still sealed." I told her it was. She exhaled. "Good. Do not open it. I need you to promise me that." I told her I didn't open things without understanding them. She said, "The samples in Corridor 7 include 2 samples from individuals who showed full resistance, not partial, full. The analysis on those samples is not in the files on the hard drives. I kept it separated deliberately. I have it here with me. It's the piece that makes the rest of the data usable. Full resistance. 2 people whose biology had done something that no one else's had done, something that was potentially the beginning of whatever came after this. She had the analysis. She'd taken it out of the compound on purpose, not because she was scared, because she'd understood that putting everything in one place was the same as having nothing in a fire. "Where are you?" I asked. She gave me coordinates. Avery County, as she'd said, about 75 miles from us. "Can you come here?" I asked. A pause. Then, "I need 4 days. The road I'm on is compromised in 2 places, and I have to work around it." Another pause. "I need you to stay dark on this channel until I'm inside your perimeter. If someone else is listening, and I have reason to believe someone else might be listening, I don't want them to be able to triangulate." I thought about Russell, about the organized convoy that had made contact with everyone in the region, about the 2 radio contacts that had gone quiet. "Understood," I said. "Come when you're ready. Main entrance. Knock." She said, "I know where the entrance is." Something in her voice that might have been dry humor, or just exhaustion. "I'll see you in 4 days." Day 119. We went quiet. Donna maintained the Walt exchange, too suspicious to drop it entirely, and Walt deserved the contact. But we said nothing about Voss. Nothing about what was coming. I spent the days preparing. I went through the medical room with Patricia and made sure everything that could be clean was clean, and everything that could be ready was ready, because Voss might arrive in any condition. I also spent some time in the escape tunnel, not opening anything, just sitting in it for a while. The south branch, specifically. I'd been thinking about the tunnel as an exit, the emergency scenario, get out quick route. I started thinking about it differently, as a position. Somewhere you could be that wasn't in the main compound but was still connected to it. If something happened at the main entrance, if someone got inside who shouldn't be inside, the tunnel gave you an option, a specific, directional option, with a specific exit point. I put a pack in the tunnel. Emergency pack, 3 days of food, 2 liters of water, the field knife, a headlamp, the most critical documents I'd put together from Pemberton's journals and the hard drives. If something went very wrong and we needed to leave with nothing else, the pack was there. Day 122, Voss arrived. She knocked at 11 a.m. 3 knocks, pause, 2 more. The same pattern I'd established with Donna and Floyd. She'd gotten the pattern from I don't know where. She was 50-something. Shorter than her voice had suggested, though I know that's an irrational thing to say. She looked like someone who'd been moving hard for a long time and wasn't complaining about it. She had a backpack and a separate hard case, the kind used for laboratory samples, temperature-controlled, with a battery indicator on the side showing 80%. She walked into the hub and stopped. She looked around with the specific expression of someone who knows a place but hasn't been in it for a while, taking inventory of what had changed, what was the same. Then she looked at me and said, "You did better than I expected with this place." I told her what we'd done. She walked the facility with me and Donna for about 2 hours, asking specific questions about the systems, the fuel levels, the food inventory. She went to corridor 7 and stood in front of the sealed door for about a minute without saying anything. "Is everything intact?" she asked finally. "As far as we can tell from outside," I said. "Floyd checks the seal weekly." She nodded. "Leave it 1 more week. I have things I need to set up before we open it. If we open it," she turned to look at me. "The containment is good, but it's not infinite. Once we open it, we're committing to a specific timeline for the analysis work. I need to be ready for that." I said we'd leave it a week. She met the others. Floyd, Lena, then Russell and his group in a meeting at the main house that was more formal and somewhat tense. Russell treated her with a respect that seemed genuine. She treated him with a wariness that also seemed genuine. They reached a provisional working understanding in about 45 minutes, which I watched and noted as competent adult pragmatism on both sides. The Avery County contact, she told us, was a retired virologist named Edwin, who'd been building on a separate research track for years, focused on immune response variation in prior coronavirus exposure cohorts. He was in his 70s, in decent health, not mobile enough to travel. He'd been the one who found the 2 fully resistant individuals. He'd done the initial analysis. He was still in Avery County, in his house, with 6 months of food in his basement and a shortwave radio, and no intention of leaving. "He's the source," she said. "Everything flows from his original findings." "Is he in contact with you?" "Every day," she said, "on a channel that only we know." Day 128. I've been sitting with something for the last several days that I want to say on this record. I think about Pemberton a lot. I think about a man who spent 20 years preparing for a thing he couldn't convince anyone else to prepare for, who built this exact facility for this exact situation, and who didn't make it here. I think about what that is as a life. Not sad exactly, or sad, but something else too. Something like, he completed his work. He just didn't get to see it used. All the journals, the operational manuals, the carefully labeled binders, and the precisely stocked shelves, and the very specific thought he put into making this place accessible to someone who was smart enough and careful enough to find it. All of that was aimed at an outcome he knew he might not be present for. I think about the note he left, read from the beginning. He knew someone else might find it. He was talking to me, or to whoever me turned out to be. I'm not a particularly sentimental person. I've been told that, by people who knew me before, in a way that was sometimes criticism and sometimes observation. The surveyor brain. always mapping, always noting, always standing one step outside the thing you're looking at. I think that was true. I think it's been getting less true over the last 4 months underground, and I don't know if that's loss or gain. Probably neither exclusively. Lena asked me yesterday what I missed most. From before. It was an evening conversation, after dinner. The kind that happens when 4 people have been living together long enough to run out of safe topics and start into the real ones. I said I missed silence. Not the underground silence. Not the mechanical hum and the ventilation whisper. Actual outside silence. The specific quiet of a mountain ridge in winter, before anything has moved. She thought about that. Then she said she missed running water. Not drinking water, not showered water. She meant the sound. A river. She'd spent 2 years studying watersheds, and she said she could not have told you before how much she'd been listening to it the whole time. We sat with that for a while. Day 135. The Corridor 7 decision. Voss was ready. She'd spent a week setting up the laboratory workspace in Corridor 5, calibrating the equipment, going through the samples she'd brought in the hard case. She walked me through what she was going to do, in enough detail that I could understand it, not so much detail that I'd be in the way. The Corridor 7 samples were going to come out in specific conditions. Gloves, full PPE from the medical room supply, the containment cabinet in Corridor 5 running. The samples were in sealed vessels. Normal handling conditions were adequate. The risk was not from handling correctly. The risk was from handling incorrectly, which she had no intention of doing. We opened the door. The room was exactly as it had been. Cold, clinical, sealed. The specimen storage refrigerators were running. Temperature gauges in the green. The containment cabinet. The workbenches. The chemical storage cabinet with the digital lock, which Voss opened with a code she had in her head. She worked for about 4 hours in a focused, quiet way that I found both impressive and slightly unnerving, because watching a scientist work is a lot of watching something that looks very simple, very small movements, very deliberate placement, and knowing that all the significance is happening at a scale you can't see. I sat outside the Corridor 7 door the whole time, not hovering, just present. When she came out, she pulled off her gloves in that specific double-handed outward peeling motion and said, "Sample integrity is maintained. All 38 primary samples, both full resistance samples, and the serum archive. Everything Aldous put in there is intact." Then she sat down on the floor in the corridor, which surprised me. She just sat down on the concrete floor with her back against the wall, and I sat down next to her because that seemed like what the moment called for. After a moment, she said, "He spent 17 years building toward this. He collected field samples from 16 countries. He funded the research that found the 2 full resistance cases. He built this facility so the information would survive." And then she stopped. "He didn't make it," I said. "No," she said. We sat there for a while. Then she said, "But the information made it." Day 141. Midwinter now. The cold has been consistent for 3 weeks. Temperatures outside dropping below 10 Fahrenheit at night. Lena, who has taken over the surface observation rotations with a level of skill that makes me feel clumsy by comparison, reports minimal infected movement on the ridge for the past 11 days. The lower roads, as seen on the cameras, are largely empty. The compound is functional and stable. The fuel math, with Voss's more precise calculations and a few further reductions in non-essential power use that Floyd engineered, now shows us approximately 22 months of diesel remaining. The food inventory is at about 93% of what I found when I arrived. We're 4 people below ground, 10 people above, 14 total. Walt is still in contact. His group has had one health emergency, a respiratory illness that moved through most of the group, nothing fatal. Managed with the supplies they had and over radio guidance from Patricia and Donna together. Walt himself caught it and sounded terrible on the radio for about 9 days, and then sounded fine. Russell is doing what he said he'd do, managing the perimeter, documenting what moves through the area, not pushing into the compound's decisions. He and I have found a working relationship that isn't warm, but is functional. He's careful and organized, and his people are disciplined. I don't know if I trust him fully. I don't think I need to, for this to work. Lena knocked on my door at about 11 p.m. last night, which was unusual. She only does that when something is actually wrong. She said, "There's a vehicle on the south camera. It stopped at the tree line, and it's been there for 40 minutes. We both went to the control room. Camera 6, the Forest Service Road. A vehicle, stopped, lights off. 40 minutes, now 45. I called Russell on the compound to outbuilding radio. He said his people were aware and had been watching. He said, 'Let me go check.' I said, 'Carefully.' He said, 'Always,' and something in the way he said it made me believe him. 20 minutes later on the radio, it's a single person, woman. She walked up from the south tree line when she saw my light. She said she found a note in a farmhouse in Yancey County and followed the coordinates. I closed my eyes for about half a second. 'Is she okay?' I asked. 'Tired,' Russell said. 'She has a hard case with her, temperature controlled.' He paused. 'She said to tell you, trust the data, not the models.' I looked at Lena. Lena said, 'That's Voss's line.' 'That's Voss's contact,' I said. 'Edwin's contact. Another piece of this.' 'She's not Voss,' Lena said. 'Different person, I think. Different piece of this.' I put on my coat. I went up through the main entrance. I crossed the shelf and started down the ridge trail to meet whoever was there. The cold was absolute. The sky above the trees was clear, and the stars were the kind of sharp, specific bright that only happens at altitude in winter, when there's nothing in the air to soften them. I could see my breath. I walked carefully, steadily, listening to the mountain. At the bottom of the ridge, Russell was standing with someone I hadn't seen before. Small person, bundled in layers, the temperature-controlled case in their right hand. They looked up when I came around the last turn of the trail. I stopped. She said, "You left a note in the farmhouse." "I did," I said. She said, "I think I have the last piece." I looked at her for a moment. Then I looked up at the ridge, at the hidden entrance to a compound I'd stumbled into by accident, that a man I'd never met had built for a catastrophe he'd spent his life dreading and couldn't survive to witness, that now held the only comprehensive biological research into what had ended the world as anyone knew it. I looked at the compound I'd been maintaining and protecting and sharing and fighting for and living inside for 141 days. Then I said, "Come inside. It's cold." She said, almost to herself, "I know it's cold." She'd been outside a long time. That was all she meant. She'd been outside a long time, and inside was warm, and there was food and light and people who were trying to do something that mattered. The trail behind us was empty. The trees were still. Somewhere below the ridge, far down in the valley, something was moving. I heard it in the way you hear things in winter, carried further by the cold air. But it was slow, and it was far, and tonight at least it wasn't our problem. I turned up the trail. She followed. We went inside. Day 167. February now. I've been less regular with the camera logs, not because less is happening, but because what's happening is slower and more difficult to describe on a daily basis. Voss and the new arrival. Her name is Irene. She'd worked with Edwin on the cohort study. She was the one who'd done the statistical analysis on the resistance profiles. Have been working in Corridor 5 for 3 weeks, methodically, carefully. They don't talk about what they're finding in real time. They compile, they verify, they cross-reference against what's on the hard drives. I've taken over managing the surface operations almost entirely, which means the route scouting and the external supply runs, and the management of what Russell's group does and doesn't know about. It suits me. I'm better outside than I am underground, and after 5 months I think I've accepted that the compound is a resource more than a home, and the outside is where this actually gets determined, one careful trip at a time. The third expedition was the most significant one. 15 days ago, Lena and Russell, and 2 from Russell's group, drove north to a town about 40 miles out, where the satellite data suggested a warehouse facility had been operational as a supply point early in the outbreak. We found it had been picked over. Roughly 60% of what it might have held was gone, but the remaining 40% included 400 gallons of diesel fuel in drums, a pallet of canned goods that hadn't been reached, and something I hadn't expected, a fully stocked first aid and minor surgical supply cache, still sealed, from a federal emergency reserve. We loaded every vehicle to capacity and came back. The fuel extended our timeline to something past 2 years again. I exhaled something I'd been holding for a long time when Floyd ran the new calculation. Russell, on the drive back, was quiet for most of it. We'd been moving in convoy, his vehicle lead, mine trail, and at a gas station that we'd flagged on the way out as possibly worth checking, he pulled over and went inside while I kept watch. He came out with 3 things: a bag of beef jerky, a bottle of ibuprofen, and a printed photograph that must have been in the register drawer or somewhere equally mundane, stuck in some ordinary place before all of this. He showed it to me. It was a photo of a family, a woman, a man, 2 kids, a dog, standing in front of a Christmas tree. The kind of photo that was in a million register drawers and wallet pockets and refrigerator magnet frames. The kind that's so ordinary, it's invisible until it isn't. He looked at the photo for a moment, and then he put it in his jacket pocket. He didn't say anything. I didn't ask. We drove back to the compound in convoy in the winter light, moving carefully, watching the roads. Day 182. Voss came out of Corridor 5 at 6 p.m. yesterday and told us what she had. We were all in the hub. All 4 of us from inside, Patricia from outside, Russell. Irene sat next to Voss. Donna had made coffee. Floyd had his hands around his mug the way he always does. Voss said, "The 2 full resistance cases show a specific genetic variant in a group of immune system proteins. The mechanism is in the hard drive data, but the verification is in Edwin's cohort work, which Irene ran the statistical analysis on. The variant produces a response to the pathogen that..." She stopped, restarted. "The pathogen needs to bind to a specific receptor type to initiate the neurological cascade. In these 2 individuals, the receptor configuration is different enough that the binding can't complete. The cascade doesn't start." Nobody said anything. She continued, "The important thing, the thing I want you to understand clearly, is that this variant isn't unique to those 2 people. It's rare, but we see it at a low frequency in a larger population. Edwin's cohort of 42 showed 5 additional individuals with partial expression of the variant. Partial means the cascade initiates more slowly. Partial means the inhibition is less complete." She looked around the room. "Partial might mean reversible, with intervention. We don't know yet." Still nobody said anything. "We can't develop a treatment from this in this facility," she said. "I want to be clear about that. What we have is a map, a starting point. What this requires is a functional research laboratory, qualified personnel, and time. We don't have the first 2 here." She paused. "But we know this much more than we knew a year ago. A year ago, nobody knew this. We know it because Aldous spent 17 years building toward it." I looked at the camera on the wall. This camera, the one I've been talking to since day 32. I thought about Pemberton sitting in a chair in this room 13 years ago, recording a video saying, "I don't have children. I wasn't close to most people, but this is what I could give." Floyd said, very quietly, "So what do we do with it?" Voss said, "We get it to someone who can use it. There are research facilities that were hardened, designed to survive infrastructure collapse. One of them is in Research Triangle Park. I know it specifically because I worked there. I left the building in early March, and it was operational. The building is hardened. The equipment is there." She looked at the table for a moment. "I don't know if anyone is still in it, but the building is there. Research Triangle Park, roughly 220 miles from here." 220 miles. I looked at Russell. He was already looking at me. He said, "What's the route?" "Day 190. I want to get this recorded now, before we leave, because I don't know exactly what we'll find, or how long this takes, or whether everything goes the way we're planning it." The route to Research Triangle Park runs east, generally, on routes that Lena and I have been scouting in sections over the past 8 days. Not all of it. We don't have the range to scout all of it without committing to the trip itself, but the first 80 miles we've seen most of. The roads are passable, the infected density on the secondary routes is low, and the cold weather continues to slow what's out there. We're not all going. The compound needs people. Floyd and Donna stay. Irene stays with the hard drives and the research files. The most important thing is that the data doesn't all travel in the same vehicle, in case of the worst. Floyd has a copy of everything on a separate drive, which he's been setting up as a proper backup system with Donna over the past 2 weeks. Voss is going. She knows the building. She knows who might be there, if anyone is. She knows what to say if there are people there, and how to say it. Russell is going, with 2 of his people. He's been mapping this region for months, and he has information about the roads that we don't have from the compound cameras. Lena is going. I didn't debate this with her because she wasn't asking to debate it. She said, "I'm the best navigator we have, and you know it." She's right. I know it. I'm going. The record requires a narrator. We leave at first light tomorrow. 3 vehicles, convoy, moving east. Walt knows we're making a significant move. I told him on the radio. No specifics, just, we're going east for something important. He said, safe driving, which from Walt is practically a speech. Patricia is staying with Donna and Floyd at the compound. Between the 3 of them, plus Dale and several others from Russell's group who are staying behind, the compound will have 9 people, and the full supply stock and the backup drive, and all the months of work we've done to make this place functional and safe. If we don't come back, if the road turns out to be worse than we scouted, or something happens that we don't come back from, the compound survives. The information survives. The people here survive. That's what Pemberton built it for. Day 190. Final entry before departure. I'm in the hub. It's 4:30 in the morning by the clock. The control room's indirect lighting is on its dim nighttime setting, and everything is blue-gray and quiet. The generator is running its steady hum that I've come to know so well I don't register it consciously anymore. The way you stop hearing a river after you've been next to it long enough. I've been sitting here for about an hour, not because I can't sleep. I slept well enough, 4 hours, which is good for me, because I wanted to sit here for a while before the morning started. In this room, with these screens showing the outside on 7 camera feeds. Camera 1, the main gate, the chain I put back after I drove through it on the first day, closed and still. Camera 2, the front of the house, dark, undisturbed. Cameras 3 and 4, the rear grounds, the bare field, the old garden beds under snow. Camera 5, the ridge trail, empty. The tree line along the upper slope, black against a sky that's starting, faintly, to separate dark from darker in the east. Camera 6, the Forest Service Road, empty. Camera 7, the Pharmacy Street. The Pharmacy Street is empty tonight. Has been, most of this week. Whatever was moving through it in the early days has moved on to wherever things move on to. I've been thinking about what Pemberton wrote in his last journal entry. This isn't the variant we modeled for. He was right. What came wasn't what he'd expected. It was worse in some ways, and stranger in others. The models he built didn't capture what actually happened, and nothing about what came next fit cleanly into any scenario he'd planned for. He'd built his shelter and stocked his shelter, and written his journals and recorded his video, and arranged everything as carefully as anyone could arrange anything, and none of it went the way he'd drawn it. But here we are. 4 people who found the place by a combination of professional habit and desperation, and the specific luck of being in the right position to notice what needed noticing. A compound that held everything he put into it. Research that might, not definitely, not yet, be the beginning of something. And tomorrow, a road east. I'm going to leave this camera running. Not for me. I won't be here to watch it, for the record. For Donna and Floyd and the others who stay. For whoever comes after. The next person who finds this place the way I found it, by accident or by search, following some thread of careful noticing that leads them here. I'll say what Pemberton said, because he said it better than I can. If you're watching this, you've found the compound, and you've found the archive, and here you are. I'd add one thing, which he didn't say, and which I need to say for the record. It's not as alone as it feels. Whatever you're thinking when you walk in here, and the door closes behind you, and the ventilation hums and there's no daylight, and you don't know if anything you do will matter. It's not as alone as it feels. I know because I was here, and I thought those things and they turned out to be wrong. The record shows that. Whatever else it shows that. The clock says 4:53. In about an hour, I need to go wake the others and start loading the vehicles. Before that, I'm going to sit here a few more minutes and listen to the compound hum and watch the cameras show nothing happening on a quiet mountain in the middle of winter. Camera 5. The ridge trail, the tree line, the sky above it getting lighter by a fraction of a degree, barely visible, the kind of change you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. Paying attention is the only thing I know how to do.